Good afternoon. My name is Peter Arlett. I head the Data Analytics and Methods Task Force within the European Medicines Agency, and it's my pleasure to welcome you from the EMA building in Amsterdam and to welcome you to this joint Heads of Medicines Agencies EMA workshop on artificial intelligence in medicines regulation. We have a workshop running over 2 afternoons, and today we'll be focusing on the state of the art, as well as various use cases of artificial intelligence in the life cycle of medicinal products. And tomorrow we will be listening to stakeholders' views, and that should feed into prioritizing actions on artificial intelligence and identifying gaps, because this workshop will inform the work plan of the European Medicines Agency for 2022 and also the work plans of various national competent authorities. So therefore, the work plan is a driver of content for artificial intelligence in the European regulatory network over the next couple of years. And it will also contribute to delivering the network strategy to 2025, where we'll hear tomorrow artificial intelligence and data analytics and digitalization are one of the key pillars for the network strategy for the next few years. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. So the workshop is being recorded and broadcast live, and people who are participating in the WebEx meeting are consenting to that recording and broadcasting by participating. This was put into the material sent to you before the meeting. All participants are muted by default. This is just to save having background noise and interference. When we get to questions and answers, and we have multiple questions and answer sessions through the 2 afternoons, we would ask you to put your questions into the chat box. You can find the box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and when using the the Q&A box, please make sure that you send the messages to everyone, because it's very difficult to monitor lots of multiple private interventions. To facilitate the dialogue, all participants are taking part in several sessions, and they're planned over 2 days. You'll be able to ask your questions and make the comments via the Q&A box. As the event has a large participation, we are going to avoid using the raised hands because we think it'll run more smoothly if we use the Q&A box. Finally, the session moderators will voice your questions to the speakers. And due to time constraints, do forgive us if we don't manage to address all the questions that go into the Q&A box. So with those housekeeping remarks, I therefore take great pleasure in introducing Emma Cook, the EMA Executive Director, to give some opening remarks. Emma Cook, please.
Thank you very much, Peter. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this EMA and HMA workshop on artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence and novel digital technologies can really bring a paradigm shift to healthcare by increasing efficiency in processes and providing deeper insights from data. This weekend, I was reading the Financial Times. I was actually reading it online, though I really do prefer to read it in the pink paper version. And there was actually an article on artificial intelligence. And the title of this was, What separates humans from AI? It is doubt. And I want to come back to this later. The applications of artificial intelligence in the life cycle of medicines are immense. Potentially, AI can be used to do a large number of different activities. It can identify new molecular targets. It can optimize patient selection in clinical trials. It can monitor the treatment effect. It can detect anomalies in drug manufacture. It can predict treatment outcomes. It can make sense of large unstructured data and can help us to automate drug administration from medical devices, among many other possibilities. And the age of artificial intelligence and digitalization is also the age of data-driven decision-making. Data is really at the root of artificial intelligence, and every day healthcare produces and collects increasingly larger amounts of data. a responsible use of data and also these novel methods requires us to readdress with increasing care the long-standing data challenges that we've all come across, including data quality, data privacy, the representativeness of data, and of course, research ethics. The European Medicines Agency is fully aligned with the European Commission's agenda on artificial intelligence. In its white paper, the European Commission highlights trust as a building block for the European approach. Developers of AI tools need to build trust, not just for regulatory purposes, but trust with society as a whole. And this means they have to build in this concept of doubt, because if we don't build in the concept of doubt, we're not going to get the benefits that humans can bring to this process, whether this be by, this has to be part of the process. So how do we help? How do we ensure that there is trust in artificial intelligence? How do we ensure that there's trust in an algorithm's performance? How do we ensure that there's trust that the risks of displacing a human are adequately identified, monitored, and managed, and that the doubt factor is built in? How do we ensure that what the methods we use don't bias against a particular personal characteristic? In fact, the trio of data, digital technologies, and skill sets has been explored and discussed extensively in 3 key initiatives at European level in the pharmaceutical regulatory area. So EMA, HMA, and member states have been involved in the Big Data Task Force, the Regulatory Science Strategy, and the Network Strategy. And all of these put data and new approaches at the heart of the future. In this first joint HMA-EMA workshop on artificial intelligence, the key recommendations of these initiatives will be presented. On this fast-moving topic, this is an opportunity to take stock of the prioritization of these recommendations and to identify any potential gaps. To help us guide this discussion, the workshop features talks on the potential and innovation, to help us guide our approaches. So the workshop includes talks on the potential and innovative applications of AI. And importantly, it's expected that the workshop will have a very concrete outcome, a renewed set of recommendations on how to progress the use of AI in medicines regulation. I'm very pleased to note the interest that this workshop has raised and the variety of stakeholders that have asked to be involved with this activity. We have patients, we have healthcare professionals, we have academia, research institutions, regulatory authorities, pharmaceutical industry, and the medtech industry. So I'm therefore delighted to finalize my closing remarks and to wish you an enjoyable and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Emma Cook, for opening remarks. We move then straight on to hear from Carl Broyce, chairman of BfArM, who will be giving some opening remarks from heads of medicines agencies, national agency perspective. Carl, over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, loud and clear, sir. It was worth waiting for.
Okay, so thanks a lot for your patience. There have been some technical problems. So anyhow, I'm also pleased to welcome you very much to this joint EMA and HMA workshop on artificial intelligence. I think we all are clear that the present and the future of healthcare and health systems is more and more driven by digital therapeutics, techniques, and developments. We are all facing an increasingly digital health ecosystem in which classic pharmaceutical and medical device approaches are merging now more and more. And data, and particularly their interconnectivity, are becoming more and more important. And not only in view of the continuously growing volume of data, e.g. also through digital applications in everyday care, use of wearables, and even digital therapeutics under development. AI is playing an increasingly important role here and has the potential to ease, from regulators' network perspective, our regulatory work, not only in the medicinal product, but also in the medical device sector a lot. And today's presentation will show this to all of us. By accelerating this knowledge transfer, better and faster analyses, and optimized therapies, AI can give us comprehensive tools that improve the quality of our work, reduce errors, and speeds up our processes. As already mentioned by EMA, AI is therefore considered in the HMA EMA Joint Regulatory Strategy to 2025 and the work program of the joint HMA and EMA Big Data Steering Group, but also in our telematic strategy of the network. The European data space is a key priority of the European Commission, as will be explained by André Rich in a few minutes, and it has been taken on board by the recent presidencies of Portugal and Germany. So we will see in the future models connecting startups, industry, medical insights, and experts from around the world to accelerate healthcare advances. Sharing these experiences from the network today and tomorrow, sharing different perspectives where we see AI coming into our pathway, is of high value to make the best possible use of the related opportunities and to shape tomorrow's health together. An excellent program has been put together by the organizers, so I'm looking forward to your discussions with all stakeholders, academia, regulators, industry, and last but not least, patients' perspective on AI as a paradigm-shifting technology in medicine's regulation, and looking forward to your recommendations for the next concrete steps. So I congratulate you to this excellent program, and I'm looking forward to the next steps and discussions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Carl, and thank you for providing that perspective and outlining the promise that artificial intelligence has in terms of medicines regulation and healthcare, particularly if that promise is managed carefully and we seize the opportunity. Now, we don't yet have André Rich from the European Commission online, but I'm very pleased to announce that his colleague Janos will speak on behalf of the Commission, and I hand over to you, Janos, please. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, my director cannot join. He has some technical problems, so I will give his speech on his behalf. So he's sorry that he cannot join because of the technical problems, but he's delighted to participate in this workshop on artificial intelligence. The advancements in AI, and particularly in machine learning, have created a promising potential to transform a number of domains, including healthcare. These advancements have become possible thanks to the abundance of health data, as it was also noted just a while ago. Machine learning can provide great healthcare opportunities by automating certain clinical tasks, supporting clinicians in decision-making, and explaining clinical capacities. Machine learning could be identifying complex biological relationships and could consequently enhancing personalized medicine. Bioinformatics is a domain which could substantially benefit from these developments. The application of machine learning in bioinformatics could be useful in the prediction of biological processes, prevention of diseases, and personalized treatments. The advancement in computational power combined with AI technology could be also used to revolutionize the drug development processes. There are important ongoing developments, policy and legal developments at EU level that aim to address challenges in relation to the development, deployment, and use of AI that we need to overcome in order to reap the benefits of AI in healthcare. More specifically, in 2017, the Medical Devices Regulation and IVDR revolutionized and upgraded our system applicable to medical device software, reinforced the risk classification scheme and the requirements of clinical evidence and clinical investigations required prior to placing software and AI on the market. Nearly all software now must undergo notified body certification, and guidance on how these new rules apply has been published by the MDCG. In addition, the EU is very active in the international level, in dedicated regulatory discussions with global partners on AI. These fora include the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum, where we are represented as Commission alongside a number of EU agency representatives. These discussions are critical to achieving a harmonized and consistent approach on how we address all AI qualified as medical device. The EU is committed to advancing these discussions, seeking convergence where possible. Also in 2017, the European Parliament, in a resolution with recommendations to the European Commission, stated that it is of vital importance for the legislature, addressing the Commission, to consider the legal and ethical implications of AI, but at the same time, it highlighted the need that any legislative efforts should not stifle innovation. On April 25th, 2018, the Commission published its strategy on AI, where it emphasized the objective to ensure an appropriate ethical and legal framework based on the Union's value and the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. In June 2018, the Commission appointed the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence that produced two deliverables: the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI and the policy and investment recommendations for trustworthy AI. This foundational work led the EC in February 2020, last year, to publish a white paper on AI, which I'm sure you're all aware of. The white paper on AI contained policy proposals to implement the EU's human-centric approach to artificial intelligence. The proposals aim to create an ecosystem of excellence, which can only be realized if accompanied by an ecosystem of trust. To create an ecosystem of excellence, the Commission proposes to use Horizon Europe and Digital Europe program to support initiatives focusing on AI investment, uptake, research, and skills. In a few days, actually on April 21st, 2021, this is in a couple of days, the Commission envisaged to publish a reviewed coordinated plan of joint actions and a proposal for a regulatory framework on AI. The forthcoming proposal for a regulatory framework on AI, it will be the first in its kind, I have to say, maybe worldwide, proposes a risk-based and proportionate regulatory approach to create an ecosystem of trust. The identification of high-risk AI systems is carried out through a combination of, first, sector, and healthcare is identified as a possible high-risk sector, and two, concrete use of the system. Mandatory requirements are imposed. So yes, coming back to the forthcoming proposal. As I said, it would basically based on the combination of sector-specific to identify high-risk AI systems, as well as a concrete use of the system. Mandatory requirements are imposed only for high-risk AI systems. So basically, this regulation would be applicable, the rules in this regulation, only for high-risk AI systems as will be defined in the regulation. These obligations include data quality, record and keeping, transparency, robustness, accuracy, and security, as well as human oversight. So there will be regulations involving all these sections. As far as non-high-risk AI systems are concerned, a voluntary label would be considered. With regard to regulated sectors, example medical devices, the white paper pointed to the fact that duplications shall be avoided, meaning that AI-targeted requirements of the new AI outline shall be assessed as part of the existing conformity assessment systems foreseen by existing legislation. And here is more specifically referring to the medical devices regulation. As I noted at the beginning of my talk, data play a fundamental role in developing AI. The availability of high-quality data and the possibility of using, combining, and reusing data from various sources in a GDPR-compliant way are essential prerequisites for the development and deployment of AI systems. Consequently, the Commission in 2020 took preparatory actions for the establishment of the so-called European Health Data Space. The Commission is currently working on the legal proposal on the European Health Data Space. Actions will be taken to address issues relating to governance, security, data protection and privacy, quality, infrastructures, and interoperability of data, digital health, and AI, to ensure a free flow of health data and promote the uptake and digital health and AI in healthcare. The work strands include the establishment of an appropriate legal and governance framework for the European Health Data Space, the development of EU-wide infrastructure for the exchange of and access to health data for research, policymaking, and regulatory activities, the extension of the existing infrastructure for the exchange of health data, the improvement of data quality in the health sector, and capacity building. The Commission will put forward a legislative proposal of the European Health Data Space, which, in complementarity with the general AI framework, will support the training and testing of AI algorithms, as well as the work of regulators to evaluate AI used in healthcare. The white paper on AI also pointed out that AI in healthcare might pose specificities and that the Commission is examining these challenges. In this regard, the DISANTE explores particular challenges of using AI in daily clinical practice. It looks at the relationship between the AI system, the healthcare professional, and the patient. Among other issues, this work aims to identify challenges involving the standard of care that should be set when AI is used in the clinic, information that should be provided to the patient in order to obtain her informed consent, as well as issues on ethics and the possibility of development of protocols and codes that might need to be followed to accommodate AI in healthcare. The aim is to establish an ecosystem that would allow innovation, provide certainty to healthcare professionals when using AI, and will act towards the best interest of the patients. Regarding AI in pharmaceuticals, on November 25th, 2020, the Commission published a communication on the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe. It is a key pillar of the Commission's vision to build a stronger European health union. The strategy fosters patients' access to innovative and affordable medicines. Digital transformation is affecting the discovery, development, manufacture, evidence generation, assessment, supply, and use of medicines. These include medical devices based on artificial intelligence for prevention, diagnosis, better treatment, therapeutic monitoring, and data for personalized medicines and other healthcare applications. The Commission will revise the pharmaceutical legislation to ensure that it is fully adapted to cover the new scientific and technological developments such as genomic sequencing, genomic editing technologies, and artificial intelligence. As far as pharmaceuticals are concerned, the Commission, together with the Member States, will first support collaborative projects bringing together stakeholders to take forward the use of high-performance computing and artificial intelligence in combination with EU health data for pharmaceutical innovation as provided in the Pharmaceutical Strategy for Europe. And this project will be carried out in the years 2021-2022. Secondly, propose to revise the pharmaceutical legislation to adapt to cutting-edge products, scientific developments, example genomics or personalized medicine, and technological transformation, including AI, example data analytics and digital tools, and provide tailored incentives for innovation as envisaged in the pharmaceutical strategy. And again, this is aimed for 2022. The Commission and the Member States are also cooperating to implement the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan, including a number of actions where AI will be instrumental in strengthening cancer care, including the development of a common health image database of the most common forms of cancer in order to improve AI-assisted diagnosis and treatment. To support this initiative in 2019, the Commission launched a Horizon 2020 call for proposals with 35 million available to support the development of health images analysis for AI-based cancer diagnostics and treatment. The European Commission's approach on artificial intelligence centers on excellence and trust. It aims to boost the EU's research and industrial capacity. Artificial intelligence is an area of strategic importance and a key driver of economic development. It can bring solutions to many societal challenges with particular implications on health and care. At the same time, there are socioeconomic, legal, and ethical impacts of AI that have been carefully addressed and are carefully addressed in the next Commission's steps. The EC has been actively and concretely taking actions in this regard, aiming to ensure the establishment of the European health data space, ensure the safe development, deployment, and use of AI medical devices, and will revise the pharmaceutical legislation to ensure that it is fully adapted to cover new scientific and technological developments, including AI. We should be confident that the EU is taking a leading worldwide role on AI. And as I said, the very first concrete step at a world level, I would say, is the next proposal by the Commission on the AI regulation, which should be coming out on Wednesday, the 21st of April. Thanks a lot.
Janos, huge thanks for stepping in and presenting the thoughts from the Commission perspective. I understand Andre Ries, Director, Health Systems, Medical Products and Innovation at DG Santé, has now joined. Andre, I don't want to go through the presentation again just from the interest of time, but I'm very glad that we've got such a clear presentation from the Commission, and obviously very timely, with the proposal going to be adopted by the Commission and made public later on this week. I don't know, Andre, if there were just one or two take-home messages you'd like to give before we move on to the next session. Andre?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Yanis, stepping in. In this connectivity problem, seems like AI is working or not working at the time. What very, I think, important message I would like to leave with this workshop is really we are in developing stage, and every ideas, every kind of concept is still to be developed in one hand. But on the other hand, there is an appetite to put a kind of framework in the system, and we have also to see, how this will work in the future and how this can help and hopefully organize better the way we are working on this territory. So wish you very good to today's workshop, and also I'm happy to participate as a participant in this, at least today, maybe partly tomorrow. Thank you very much. Over to Peter.
Thanks very much, Andre. And clearly, medicines regulation and all of the health benefits that innovative medicines can bring to patients is a fertile area for the use of artificial intelligence, and that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today and tomorrow. And obviously, going forward, we need to work very closely with the European Commission and the policy initiatives that you will be overseeing. So thanks very much indeed. I think with that, thanks to all of the colleagues that have given opening remarks, I think we now move on to the scene setting AI, a paradigm shifting technology in healthcare. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nikolai Brun from the Danish Medicines Agency, co-chair of the Big Data Steering Group, who's going to chair us through this next session. Nikolai, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for your kind introduction, my fellow co-chair in the Big Data Steering Group. We have a very interesting session ahead of us. As Emma Cook said, we are really at a stage where we have an opportunity to shift the paradigm within the technology in healthcare by using AI, and today we'll discuss the AI applications in medicines regulation. We have 4 speakers in this session. We have Andre Decker from Maastricht University, Peter Reinbeck from the Erasmus Medical Center, we have Lisbeth Jerris from University in Liège, and we have Atul Boot from University of California, San Francisco, Atul, who is getting up very early to join us and share his experiences with us. But we start out with Andre Decker, Professor of Clinical Data Science at the Maastricht University and medical physicist at the Maastro Clinic. Over to you, Andre, and I hope that it's okay that I keep time very sharply because we are starting a bit late, but you do, of course, have the time allotted to your presentation. We're looking very much forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. Hopefully you can hear me well and you can see my slides. Yes, and I thank you for having me here. It's quite an honor to kick off this the content of this meeting. And I was happy to hear the presentations just now talking about how important AI is for Europe and for medicine in general. So yes, I'm a professor of clinical data science. I have a group of about 40 people that work on 3 topics. We think about data. How do we get it in a privacy-preserving manner? We develop AI algorithms from that data, and we apply them in routine clinical care. So all those aspects I'll quickly touch upon just to set the scene. So I do have some disclosures to make. I'm not sure if it's needed in these types of meeting, but I wanted to better safe than sorry, right? So we do work with lots of companies on this, and including medical companies on this. Okay, now I have found it was behind a little bar here. So I just want to set the scene about where I'm coming from. So I work in a cancer clinic, and this is a study that we did a while back where we asked our physicians to predict survival of a certain type of lung cancer patients, non-small cell lung cancer patients. We basically asked our physicians, look at the chart. There were paper charts at the time, but we repeated that in the electronic age. And you can read everything you know about the patient. You can read the whole chart, and now you have to predict, will this patient be alive 2 years from now? And if there's 50% survival and the doctor is a perfect predictor of outcome, then the doctor would be able to separate the alive patients, the green ones, from the dead patients, the red ones. And if a doctor is completely random at that, you would see it as on the bottom, right? It would be very irregular or random predictions. And if the doctor was kind of good, then it was in the middle, right? You see a little bit more green prediction on the right, a little bit more red prediction on the left. And the metric for these individual predictions is called area under the curve. So 1 is a perfect predictor, so that's the top, and 0.5 is a random predictor. So then really what the doctor says doesn't make any sense, right? Now, when we did this study in our doctors in Maastricht, then the end result of that study was that the doctors had an area under the curve of 0.56, so very close to random. So what does that mean? It means that if you come into my clinic and you ask your physician's doctor, will I be alive 2 years from now? The answer that the doctor gives you is just as good as tossing a coin. And so we started this project from that perspective, that we wanted to predict in individual patients, what is your survival or your outcome in general, right, in cancer patients? Now, you may ask, why are doctors so bad at predicting outcomes, right? One answer could be the doctors in Maastricht are really bad, but that's unlikely. The real reason is that doctors are humans, and humans can take approximately 5 things into account when they make a decision, right, which is the the bottom left curve, right? If you have more than 5 things to consider in any decision in life you take, you start making mistakes. But if you know anything about care, doctors see hundreds or even thousands of facts for patients, right? Genetics and imaging and clinical data. So there's an explosion of data and they become confused. The other problem is there's an explosion of decisions, right? Also on many more medications are becoming available for lung cancer, but for any other disease. And so there's more to decide than ever. Then we have this concept of evidence-based medicine that on the crossroads of what you know about a patient and decisions you might take, you simply read the literature or the guideline or EMA documentation, but there's way too much to read. And the things that are in trials, and randomized clinical trials, for instance, are extremely biased, and they usually exclude things like multimorbid patients, elderly patients, either implicitly or explicitly. And so that's a problem, because those are the type of patients that you have to make these decisions in. And it's very hard to do some trials, like de-escalation trials or trials involving technology. And the end result is on the bottom right, is for the stuff we do in medicine, not just cancer, but for the stuff we do in medicine. This is an example of the British Medical Journal. In about a third of the cases, we have evidence that they work. In about 1/6 of the cases in medicine, we have evidence that our treatments do not work, but we do them nonetheless. And in half of the cases, we have no evidence. So given this rather bleak picture, I think it's perfectly understandable that doctors can no longer predict what outcome their treatment will have. And this is our problem that we're working on, and this is our main reason to introduce AI, because we feel AI can help there. So where we want to go to the situation where we have rapid learning healthcare, which means that we have data on all patients in every hospital. Can we extract evidence from that data? Can we use AI for that? Can we do something else in the next patient, see what happens, the evaluation of outcomes, and can we have that circle running in every hospital in the EU, but in the world really, rather than just relying on the top left, which is clinical trials or comparative effective research and so forth. And can we use that to fill in some of these evidence gaps, which you see on the right, where you have patients which simply don't fit the RCT criteria that the medicine or the technology was based on? Can we use that also to fill in those evidence gaps? Those are our goals. Now, to do that, we need a lot of data, and as was already discussed, it's not trivial to get data. Data, if you want to have data, for instance, in the EU, then you get a couple of answers. If I say people, okay, send all your data for your hospital to Maastricht, you get 4 answers. The first is, well, I don't have the time, Andre, to send you all that data and to make it what we nowadays call fair data or interoperable data. You have the political argument, I don't want you to look at my data because my data is mine and I want to use that, or you might learn something that I'm doing wrong. There's the ethical dimension, privacy mostly, right? I'm not allowed to share data, which is usually used as a front for 1 and 2, we have to admit. And there's the technical challenge, which is really low on the list in priorities. So, but we need to have this data, these barriers are there, and we need to solve them. And one of the ways we found them to solve is to not share data, right? To think about an infrastructure where you not share the data, so you don't bring the data to the researcher, to the AI algorithm that needs the data, but you bring the researcher, the AI algorithm to the data. And as was just also mentioned, this is where the data spaces come into play. By creating these data spaces, you can actually do this. Because you have then solved 2 challenges, right? You have to think about a situation. How do we move applications around Europe? How do we send it to Toulouse or to Warsaw? A train that can learn an AI algorithm from that data space or from that station, as we call it, without sharing individual patient data. You have to have lots of security, which we call track. So the questions are trains and the security around this track and the audit logs and so forth. And then we have to send each other these questions or algorithms which are agnostic to the local language, right? And to the local IT system. So that means local data has to become fair. We have to make fair data stations or fair data spaces for this to be done. So this metaphor, as you will see, is called the personal health train, and we're working very hard in Holland about this. But it perfectly fits with the data spaces, and that we're actually using data spaces for that, to get such an AI learning infrastructure and validation infrastructure running. Now, to come to the crux, which is to improve lives of patients, there are 2 main ways in which you can use AI to improve cancer care or general care, lives of patients. One is better processes. This is where we use AI to automate stuff, to do things that doctors do now, but more efficiently or more effective, like diagnosis on an image or delineation of tumors, things like that. That's one piece. I'm more interested in the second piece, which is how can we use AI for better outcomes? How can we really improve the outcome of patients? And I'll give a few examples of what we're working on. One of them is this. It may sound harsh, but it is quite important for us to know how long will this patient live, right? Because in cancer care specifically, we're giving treatments which have lots of toxicity and sometimes a lot of cost. And so we need to know how long the patient lives to understand, will this still make sense for you to get this treatment? So this is a screenshot of our patient record where we predict for an individual. So this is a fake patient. For an individual patient, we predict how long will you live? Will you live longer than 26 weeks, which is that 53% thing there. And then we have a shared decision-making with the patient saying, do you still want this treatment? Or do you want to stay your last half year outside of our hospital and do stuff that you always wanted to do, rather than being treated by us and perhaps getting all kinds of side effects. So this is an AI. Might be simple, but an AI that predicts how long you will live to support decisions. Another one is when you start going across borders, and this is done with Australia, but similarly we could do this in Europe. We have the situation where we give different treatments. For instance, in Australia, they give a very high dose of radiotherapy. In the Netherlands and in the EU in general, we give a high dose of radiotherapy. And in Australia, they give about half of the patients a low dose or a palliative dose of radiotherapy in lung cancer. And so we can use some of that data to understand how can we do better, right? And one of the things that Australia learned is that, these are the patients, this is a survival curve of a patient with which get a low dose of radiotherapy and they have a very low survival. They can do some what-if scenarios based on AI or counterfactuals. They can ask themselves, what would happen if we give some of those patients a higher dose of radiotherapy? And they would find out for some patients that the survival would be increased from 18% to 60% overall survival, so a threefold increase just by making sure that the right patients get the right treatment. Similarly, we can ask, so that's what Australia learns. Similarly, we can ask what if scenarios with AI in the Netherlands. We can ask ourselves, well, what would happen if some of the patients only got a palliative dose in the Netherlands, which we don't do, right? Because we feel it's unethical. But there are many patients, about a quarter of patients that we learned from an AI, that have no benefit from all this radiotherapy that we give, from these medicines, concurrent chemoradiation often, and they have no benefit. They just get the side effects of treatments, right? So this is where AI starts to excel, and these are things that are extremely hard to do in a randomized clinical trial. With that, I want to give one more example on what we use now in the Netherlands to really do this. So we have an AI that determines, will you get this expensive therapy? So an AI based on patient factors and some imaging related factors will determine what is the benefit for you of proton therapy compared to classical radiotherapy. And we use an AI, and the AI says yes or no. So if the AI says no, you cannot be referred to proton therapy because the AI feels it has no benefit for you. And so we're not, as a country, willing to bear this extra cost of 40,000 euros in this case. So this is now very close to changing to this paradigm shift, if you want. There are problems with AI, and one of them is that, and they're listed here, many people don't trust AI, so I'm sure we'll talk about that, right? You get these, Tesla driver dies in first fatal crash. You can ask, why is it in The Guardian? But because with Tesla, we don't trust it. There's a lot to do about usefulness of models, about evidence level and methodology of AI. I'm sure we'll talk about this. AIs generally also help you choose from existing therapies or improve efficiency of healthcare. It's not a new drug in itself, right? And that's also sometimes different. And then there's a lot of deviation from guidelines and political pressure, which AI causes. So lots of things, and of course, I have a glance over it, but the regulatory aspect of an AI, which is continuously changing, is also not trivial. With that, I hopefully given you a quick introduction about our view of this. I have a slide with thanking my colleagues especially. I'll hand it over to you, Nicolai.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, Andre, and thank you for keeping time so admirably. This is really appreciated. We have time for just a few questions to Andre. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and Luis, my co-worker at the EMA, will bring them forward. So please bring your connections or your questions to the chat. And we will try and address them. Luis, do we have any questions from the chat?
No, not yet. Can I correct? It's the Q&A. Please use the Q&A. You should not be having access to the chat at all. So please use the Q&A to put any questions if you like. Yep. But so far, no question.
But if people have questions for Andre, perhaps they can also put it during the next.
I'll hang out. Yep.
And then we just grab the first two presentations with questions there, because we will try and catch up a little bit of time. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, which is Peter Reinbeck, who is an associate professor of health data science at the Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands, who's going to speak about putting machine learning into real-world practice, patient-level prediction, development, and validation in observational data. So Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me start by saying that it's really great to be part of this meeting. It's very timely and important topic. In my presentation, I will highlight some important aspects of the development and validation of predictive models that could impact regulatory decision-making. And I will demonstrate this using a framework we have developed for patient-level prediction. Let's start by very clearly defining what the problem is that we want to tackle here. So we aim to predict which patients at a defined moment in time that enter a target population will experience some outcome during a time at risk. And for this, we only use information about the patients in an observation window prior to that moment. Now, this seems obvious, but it's extremely important we clearly define these three components. So it's important we know exactly in which population the model was trained and validated when we apply the model on our own data. But also we need to know exactly how the outcome was defined and understand what the time of period was in which this was assessed. But unfortunately, in many publications, this information is not so clear. And then in addition, I think it's very important that we specify how the model will be used and how it will inform an intervention. And I must say that using this framework of those three components, the T, the target population, the outcome, and the time at risk, you can define actually all types of prediction problems, like, for example, disease onset and progression, or treatment safety. A typical model development process is described on this slide. So there's a problem definition clearly defined, then data is extracted and used for training. The model is assessed using internal validation and hopefully also external validation. And finally, a model is disseminated, often just through a publication. Now, there are valuable guidelines for transparent reporting of such models. For example, the tripod statement, which was published in 2015, that describes the need to share all the modeling details, the need to assess both discrimination and calibration, and perform internal and external validation. The question, however, is if this is enough to move the field forward, and I believe we can do better. Our team at Erasmus MC, led by our PhD student Cynthia Young, has performed a large literature study to better understand the evolution of the field, and I'm showing you some preliminary results here. This diagram shows the strong increase in the number of prediction models used in using EHR data over time. And unfortunately, it also shows that the percentage of publications that describe external validation is still much too low. And we also looked at the number of publications that describe external validation across countries, and which is unsurprisingly even much smaller. The following diagram shows the model, how the models are assessed. And we can see that the number of studies that share calibration performance is also still very low, even after the very nice tripod statement was published. And I believe calibration is very important since it compares the percentage of patients with the outcome predicted by the model with the actual observed frequency. And it's very important that we know if and how the model will need recalibration when applied to other data. So what is it that we really need to make the next step to gain full transparency and reproducibility of predictive models? So I think one of the biggest issues that limit our ability to train and test models at a very large scale is the lack of interoperability of the data. So we need to standardize our data to a common data model that is standardizing the structure of the data as well as the terminology of the data. And we also then need to develop standardized analytical pipelines that enforce best practices, as, for example, described in the tripod statement. And this is possible because of the common data model. And we should not publish papers about models without sharing the full process in a form that others can really replicate. So we need to share the models to allow for extensive validation across many, many databases. And finally, I think it's very important that the field starts disseminating all results, even for prediction problems that didn't have a good outcome. I think it's very important that we make this next step. So in the next slides, I will share a framework that we have developed to move this forward. And our mission in this space is to develop a systematic process to learn and evaluate large-scale prediction models using observational data, and then ideally in a large data network. And we have been pushing this very hard for evidence generation, validation, dissemination with the Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics Odyssey Initiative, and also the European Health Data and Evidence Network project EDEN. So the OMOP Common Data Model is at the core of these projects. So it enables standardized analytics to generate reliable evidence. And one of the analytical packages that we have been building is the patient-level prediction package. So on this slide, you see a publication on an R package that can be executed against the Common Data Model to build, but to also validate prediction models at a large scale. And this framework enforces best practices as described, for example, in the tripod statement, and it provides tools for proper dissemination of the results. If you're interested in that, in the framework, I'd like to point you to some of the resources you see on the right, which includes a chapter in the Book of Odyssey, which is now in 3 different languages, and a course in the Eden Academy. And also results of these studies are available on data.odyssey.org. And I will demonstrate the value of this approach with some examples in the next slides to drive the discussion. So this slide shows our prediction team in action. And these photos were taken at an Odyssey symposium in Bethesda in the US, where we performed an interesting experiment to see how our framework could be used in a very, very focused effort. So what was really nice was that at the start of the symposium, we asked the approximately 400 people in the audience if they could fill in a form to identify interesting prediction problems the prediction work group could work on. And we then asked the participants to vote on a specific prediction problem. What the audience didn't know was that we had a large team waiting outside of the meeting room consisting of data scientists, medical experts, data custodians that were waiting for this specific question. And the first step was to invite the person that proposed the question to clearly define the target population outcome and time at risk and build the cohorts using interactive tools. And then the model was trained and internally validated, and there was clinical review performed using tools as well. We were then able to send a request out to externally validate the models and invited multiple databases across the world to execute the models against their common data model, and they were able to return the results for us to combine them in a kind of interactive application. So at the end of the symposium, at the end of the day, we were able to present results that the audience did not expect when they filled in the form. And it was really exciting for us because this was the start of many interesting developments and studies performed afterwards. Now, how was this possible? How could we get these first quick results in one day? Well, the CDM by itself, of course, is a crucial component in this. But not less important was the advanced set of tools that allowed for interactive discussions with the experts in modeling and validating, in the modeling and validating phase. So here you see an example of a tool called Atlas that allows to define cohorts and select these cohorts for the target and outcome. And on the right, you see functionality to define the model, covariates, and population settings. And we use this tool during a studyathon in Barcelona on rheumatoid arthritis, where we brought together experts responsible for the RA guidelines, 14 data custodians, either physically or remotely, and many data scientists. Now, the tool allows to specify multiple prediction problems and sensitivity analysis, and then allows for automatic generation of a study package that can train the models. And after that, once the model is trained, it can generate a package to externally validate that model across the network. And during the week, we collected information from all the different databases, and we're able to visualize those in a tool where you can, for example, see the ROC curve that Andre talked about, but also the prevalence in persons with the outcome and persons without the outcome of each individual covariate that was available in the data. And there are many more opportunities here and options to look into the data and to compare performance across the different models and databases. So standardizing frameworks can really help to assess these models at a large scale. And I think that's extremely important and valuable, a valuable way to assess it. Interestingly, these pipelines can, for example, even automatically generate a Word document containing all the information that's required, like the definition of the cohorts, the included concepts, but also the performance of the models across the network. So you can really kickstart the standardization of the dissemination process in a publication. And it's also very interesting to visualize results as shown in the images below. So on the left, you see the discriminative performance as a color grade of 3 algorithms, gradient boosting, random forest, and regularized regression in multiple databases. And here you see 4 very large claims databases from the US. And the columns represent the performance of the model for a certain outcome in the target population. And these kind of visualizations provide a lot of insight in how well we can train models in the individual databases. And it will help us to prioritize those outcomes that we should focus on. And on the right, you see an example where each row is a development database and each column is a validation database. And this figure shows you how well a model trained on database 1 performs on all the other databases. And because of the standardization of both the common data model and the pipeline, we can now iterate over all the databases and look and see how well the model performs when I train on this database or on another database in this very nice diagram. So there's many interesting insights that can be gained from these type of visualizations, and we should explore these much more. As a final example I want to give is the power that we have with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we were able to respond in a very short period of time to the pandemic in the end of last year already, where we were able to use flu data as a proxy for COVID and train prediction models to estimate the risk of hospital admission, hospitalization requiring intensive services, and fatality to inform shielding of patients at risk. And we tested this model on a large number of COVID-19 patients as described in this preprint. We also use a friendly scoring form to assess the risk, as you see on the left, where you can simply sum up the the presence of certain elements. You can then calculate in the middle what the predictive risk would be that would correspond to that value. And then finally, you can compare your risk with the others in the population. And we created an application, an interactive application where you can find your own individual risk. You may wonder what's next. So the team in Erasmus, led by Ross Williams, is working on a prediction model library that can host all the models developed by anyone that uses the framework. It will be a dynamic environment where researchers can download the models, execute it against their data, and upload. And this is following our, I think, very interesting paradigm that studies should not stop with a publication, but it should actually mean that the work starts with publication. And I believe that this is very valuable also from regulatory perspective, since it enables full transparency, but it also facilitates the continued evaluation of these models when more and more data becomes available. So let me close my presentation with the statement that I think that we should enable external validation of prediction models at a much larger scale and make it a requirement for models. And we have demonstrated that this is possible, for example, by assessing the performance of models developed by others and ourselves in patients with COVID-19, atrial fibrillation or type 2 diabetes, and many, many more. And I would therefore invite others in this journey and join the data network. So if you are interested in standardizing your data and you need any financial support to map your data, because it's definitely some work and you need help with that, the EDEN project can help you out. So we have an open call for data partners that opened last week, and it would be great if you can join the current list of more than 60 data sources in Europe that have standardized to the same OMO common data model. And it allows us to validate these models at a much larger scale. Finally, I'd like to thank the large team of contributors from the Odyssey Initiative and the EDEN project. It would not be possible without all these people. And I really thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for this interesting perspective. I see in the Q&A we have many questions, and Andre, you have really set the precedent. You've actually started answering many of the questions in the Q&A, so you're really making the optimal use of this technology. And perhaps, Peter, after we have this live Q&A, you will perhaps also volunteer to answer a few questions for you. Sure. But I would like to spend a few minutes on the live discussion with both you and Andre. And I can't help noticing that you, Peter, are advocating strongly for a common data model, outlining it with a perspective of OMOP and the vision as stipulated by EDEN. Andre, you are advocating a more federated system with the algorithms going to the data. I wonder if there's a conflict there, or are these two things interoperable? Are these two different perspectives, or are they actually two parts of the same coin?
I think we all agree that it's the latter, right? They're two parts of the same coin. If in our federated learning, so in the personal health train concept, you have to create this fair data station where a machine can visit your hospital and learn something from your data. That is very similar to a common data model, right? Because you have to have a common data model across these hospitals and agree on that to have this train run. And actually, the common data model that Peter is describing is called OMOP, right? And they have done personal health train style things, especially Janssen in the Honor project and also in Odyssey to do this. So it's really it's the same principle. I think the only difference is that whereas Odyssey is really forcing everyone to go to OMOP, we are more flexible. If there are a number of parties that agree on a common data model, and it's not OMOP, fine. And if it's imaging based, and imaging and OMOP doesn't really work yet well. So we're more flexible, but it's really two sides of the same coin. It's very close. What do you think, Peter?
No, I agree, Andre. And just to be very clear, Nicola, it's not true that the common data is a central model, right? So this is also federated. So right. The common data model stays local. Right? It's the only thing is that each database standardizes our data locally, and then we bring the tools. Whether we call that a train or just federated analysis, I mean, that's, I think, the same thing. Andre is right, though, that we focus on one data model, and that is because we are building a huge battery of tools that could benefit from that full standardization of the data. And I'm a big advocate of that, because I think that especially some of the very large analysis that we do, for example, in population level effect estimation, where you need to correct for many variables to correct for confounding, you don't want to have like a study by study type of data model. You need to have the full data available for your analysis. And I think that standardizing to one standard could really help. And also, I think it would be great if more people start helping developing the model and building more tools as one big effort. And I think we can make a very big difference as one large community, and I'm really supportive of that.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Andre. We have two questions that I will provocatively relate to. Robert Suster-Zale is asking, how do we evaluate the accuracy of AI algorithms when they're applied across European hospitals where care standards may be different and there are differences in available data? And Jacqueline Bohr is asking, how do patients in the Netherlands react to being told no by the AI algorithm if, for instance, there's been a check on whether the patient would benefit from proton therapy? So what if the patient has an algorithm tell the patient, no, you will not benefit from this? And could you risk that you have an algorithm in one country making a different prediction from an algorithm in another country based upon the data it's trained upon?
So let me take the first question, and perhaps Peter, you can start with the other question, right? So on the proton therapy side, how do patients react? Not at all bad. We're presenting this as a model-based indication, and we simply say to patients, look, based on your characteristics, you will not benefit a lot from proton therapy compared to others, so you just get regular, which is still good therapy, right? And patients they perfectly understand that. And it happens many times in medicine where you say to a patient, well, I don't think this therapy is good for you, is really beneficial. So that if that's an AI that's telling them or a doctor, it doesn't really matter to them. Peter, perhaps you can answer the question more about the external validation part.
Yeah, no, I think a very, very good question, but this actually underlines why I think it's so important that we are able to validate these models on multiple different or in multiple settings. I'm quite sure that the model trained on HEP data would work less well on the hospital data. So the more data we actually collect and standardize, the more of the sub-analysis we can do on the individual type of database to see if we can build the best model. And coming back to your earlier point, Andre, I agree that medicine by itself is uncertain, right? So there's no truth. So that's the same is true for prediction models. And we should just understand better how they work and how we should interpret these models as well in clinical practice. So I think there's a lot to gain also in educational space around predictive models.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Andre. And perhaps I could persuade you to stay online a little bit and answer questions in the Q&A. So in order to secure that we don't get too delayed, I'd like to move on to Lisbeth Gerries, who's a research professor in biomechanics and computational tissue engineering at the University of Liège and the University in Leuven in Belgium, who will speak about AI, digital twins, and the promise of personalized medicine. Lisbeth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolai. I'm also looking for the little thing to switch my slides. Okay, there we go. So I am indeed a research professor in computational tissue engineering, but when I'm speaking to you today, I think I do this more on behalf of my role in the societies and the communities that develop digital technologies in general. And those would be the VPH Institute and the Avicenna Alliance, with members all over the world focusing on all kinds of different applications in healthcare, with as a common goal that they use digital technologies. So this is the community in the center. If we want to move from the screen to the patient, this is a community effort. So we take all the technologies that are developed the user experience. And then it is through the community that we can push this to the patient, that we can answer to policies, that we can change policies, that we can drive incentives. And if you look at the challenges that we currently face, or some of the elements that I want to talk to you about today, are some examples of the models that these digital technologies comprehend, the challenges and the stakeholders. And you will see that it's quite complementary to the two excellent presentations that we have already had today. So starting with the models, I'd like to come back to the title, which was AI, Digital Twins and the Promise of Personalized Medicine. And there are many different definitions of digital twins, but if we go really to the heart of the concept, where it all started or where it all came from, then we are talking about Industry 4.0, where a digital twin is a virtual representation of a physical object or a system across its life cycle, where there is a real-time connection between the data gathering of the physical object and the model itself. So a back and forth connection there. Now, when we use the term digital twin within the concept of personalized medicine, we kind of relax this definition a little bit. So this real-time connection, even though it's possible, there are wearables, we can do this. This real-time connection is not imposed. What you see here, for instance, is the consensus definition from a European Commission workshop on the human digital twin that we had last December. And the concept there is more that it is the direct use of individual-specific models for prevention, prediction, screening, diagnosis, and treatment of a disease, and also the development of intervention options. Now, when we talk about models, then we've talked now a lot about AI and in silico medicine, but also at the beginning, the director of EMA talked about digital technologies, and digital technologies or in silico technologies are in fact a spectrum. And if you have, on the one hand, you have the white box models, as we call them. Those are models that are based on physical laws, on really first principles. So it's very rare to have a model that is fully based on principles alone and that doesn't use any element of data. On the other hand, you have the black box models, and I'm making it a bit extreme now. Those are the ones that are driven by data and data alone. And often AI and machine learning are put in that category. But actually, most of the models that we use, most of the digital technologies that we use are somehow somewhere in between the white and the black box model. Truth is always somewhere in the middle. And you can have models that are more mechanistic, that include more mechanisms that we already know, or models that include more or that are more based on the data and maybe rely less on some of the mechanisms. But in a lot of cases, it is actually the problem that will define exactly which kind of technology that you can use. Thinking about rare diseases, thinking about my own field, regenerative medicine, where if we want to do AI for clinical trials, this is a problem because there are not enough patients, there is not enough good high quality data to really run these data-driven models reliably. So we are forced to include some of the mechanistic information, some of the mechanistic knowledge that we already have. And what I want to do briefly is show you two examples of how the phenomenological part or the data-driven part and the mechanistic part can actually reinforce one another. And the first example is from a colleague in Oxford, where there were a number of patients that had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that had been followed, that had been given a Holter. And so there was information from that Holter that could be read out. And they're using a machine learning and a clustering approach based on the biomarkers that we could identify from the Holter information, from the ECGs of the patients. 4 groups of patients were identified, and they were paired, what you see in the top middle, with the clinical images. Now then, this was identifying what patient groups there were, so the who. In the next step, they used their multi-scale mechanistic model, starting from the images of the patients, developing a computational model that went all the way down to the mechanistic or the mechanisms of the function of the ion channels to try and identify why, for these specific patients, they actually got this specific ECG readout. And this would then explain what was going on, and could also immediately lead to more handles for drug therapy. Another example that I wanted to show you is a distributed artificial intelligence. Is an agent-based model called the Universal Immune System Simulator by the colleague Professor Papalardo from Catania, who made a model of a very comprehensive model of the human immune system that was used for development of vaccines in COVID-19, but also in tuberculosis. And in very simple terms, in the project in tuberculosis, what they did was first train the model based on the data that they had with respect to the disease progression. So on the top, you have the patients. On the top, very simply represented in a simplified way, the model that was trained. And then the model was also trained on treatment information. And then in the next step, finally, the model was then able to make predictions on virtual cohorts, comparing different treatment strategies. This model is now in the phase where it is preparing qualification advice. So this has actually been submitted to EMA to be used as a tool in designing clinical trials for vaccine development in tuberculosis. Not only can models be used when you talk about clinics and really close to the patient, models can also be used in other phases of the R&D pipeline of the design of drugs and devices. So from discovery, the preclinical phases, the clinical phases, and then in the next step, even when you get data after the product has been launched, you can collect the real world information and use that to improve your product or your therapy for the patient. Now, what are some of the challenges? And some have already been outlined. So I don't need to, you will see data coming back here. I don't need to talk about that. There are challenges related to the model technology. Different scales, comorbidities, how do we deal with rare diseases? How do we define our virtual populations if we want to do in silico clinical trials? Those kind of things. Then there is, of course, the data aspect, as I already said, that has been discussed quite well before. There is the uptake. Patient trust has been mentioned. Clinical workflows, this needs to be integrated somehow in a very busy schedule of the clinician. So this cannot mean that there need to be a lot of extra work. This needs to be organized quite smoothly. And of course, we also need a skilled workforce. So we need people that are able to develop these technologies, to implement them, and to make sure that they can be used when they need to be used. Another challenge is the sustainability. So what is the health economic model behind this? How will health technology assessment agencies work with this? The reimbursement of the use of these technologies, and what are the policies that are related? Are the policies in place that will allow this to happen? And we've already heard from the beginning, in the beginning of this afternoon, that these policies are being worked on. Now, one challenge that I would like to go into a little bit more detail on is that of regulatory approval. So how do we trust, how do we build trust in this digital evidence that these digital tools are generating? Whether it is to use the software as a medical device, so as a tool, or whether it is really the evidence that they generate. And the key elements in building this trust of the regulator are documentation, VVUQ, and standardization. Now, VVUQ, it stands for verification, validation, and uncertainty qualification. So verification, making sure that your model corresponds to your numerical model, corresponds to the mathematics behind it, that there was no mistake there. Validation, that the outcome of your model corresponds to the reality. And uncertainty quantification is to understand how the choices you made while making the model, the parameters, the assumptions, what you left in, what you left out, how that corresponds or how that affects the outcome of the model within the context of use. So within the area, within the specific question that you want to answer with your model. The next step, once this has matured, you can go to standardization. And it's only then really that it becomes easier, or that it becomes really clear what line to follow. Key concept there was the risk. So how big is the influence of the model on the clinical decision, and what are the consequences of a model being potentially wrong on the life of the patient? And so, of course, when you have a high influence on the decision and a high consequence of the model, then you need to do a lot of verification and validation. What you see on the right-hand side of the slide is taken from a discussion paper on software as a medical device, so focusing on AI in healthcare, where they use the same concepts on influence and model consequence. Now, on the European side of things, for digital technologies in general, so not specific AI, more focusing on the mechanistic models, we're collaborating already as a community with EMA to set up a pipeline, really a flow chart of the steps to take in order to make sure that your digital evidence can be trusted. And the flowchart looks something like this. So you start with a good definition of what it is that your model needs to answer, what question the model needs to answer, and then you go through the description of your model, of the context of use, what are the criteria that you deem would lead to model acceptability, and the core there again is the model risk assessment. So the risk, as I came to explain it, based on the influence and the impact, and also how does it compare when you use extra technologies like in silico or digital technologies? How does it compare with what was previously done when these technologies weren't around? And then you go from credibility activities where you build actually the evidence that you provide to the regulator and you apply it and it comes into the decision-making pipeline. This for AI can follow similar steps, except for, as was already mentioned, when you have something that changes all the time with every new data point that you add, you have to in principle, do this all over again every time because the model changes. So there needs to be, and FDA has been doing this through a discussion nota, and recently followed up on that through a predetermined change of a control plan, and then an algorithm that can actually evaluate the change and can monitor it. All of this leads to the definition of something that is good simulation practice. So what are general guidelines that academia, industry, developing digital technologies should adhere to? Well, like we have GMP, GLP, we could have something that is called a GSP. And then finally, who are we when we are talking about doing all these things? What are the stakeholders? Well, they have already been mentioned, and I'm sure they will talk in the coming days. But it's really only when all these people work together, when all of us come together, that we can actually make this or deliver on the promise of personalized medicine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. It was really, really interesting. I think in the interest of time and also recognizing that Professor Atul Butt has joined us really, really early in the morning, his time from the University of California, San Francisco, we will gather the questions to you, Lisbeth, together with questions for Atul after the presentation. And perhaps you would take the minutes in between to perhaps start answering a few questions in the Q&A, Lisbeth, because I know that your presentation will generate a lot of interest and questions. But it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Atul Butt, that I visited first time just before COVID shut down the whole world, at his state-of-the-art center at University of California, San Francisco. And he's going to speak to us on translating 1 trillion points of data into real-world evidence and enabled intelligence for medicine. Atul, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us this early in the morning.
Thank you. Thank you. No problem. I have my coffee in hand, and I apologize to the organizers. I sent the slides so late yesterday. So we'll go with what I have here. So thanks for having me. First, obviously, one must disclose conflicts of interest. I have basically all of them. So I wouldn't blame you if you didn't believe another word I said over the next 30 minutes. I've started a bunch of companies. I consult for so many drug companies. Again, I don't blame you if you don't believe me. I'm proud of the column on the right, though. Those are all the companies started by my students. More than half my graduate students now start companies, even if they go into academia. Because in my lab, we do have a saying that if you want to change the world, you can't just keep writing papers about it. If you've invented a diagnostic or a therapeutic, then it's up to you to make sure it reaches patients one way or the other. So all the conflicts are here. All right, so look, I just caught the last few talks. I know you've been talking about big data, AI. I'm not going to stress this too much, but it is an amazing time because even the public is aware of big data and AI, especially in so many major magazines. And I think it's worth just discussing, if it hasn't already been, the bottom two covers here of these magazines from The Economist. Of course, the data deluge, we're drowning in data, of course, and we'll talk about more of that in a moment. But on the right there is the scary aspect of this, that people go in believing that data is now the most valuable resource, and it shows the oil rigs here comparing data to oil. In fact, people say this all the time, that data is the new oil. I hate this term because that means, because when you think about oil, either I take that barrel of oil or you take that barrel of oil, right? You both can't have the same barrel of oil. Data is not like that, okay? We can both, I can use that data and make a diagnostic. You might use that data and figure out a therapeutic from the same data. And so the phrase I like is, data is a new soil. We have ideas, we plant them with data and watch them grow here. So it's not that I can have that data and you can't. We can both use that data for something completely different. And obviously this is taken off in biomedicine. And I'm not going to stress all this, but the way I'm using these terms, AI is the broader term. So computers mimicking aspects of human intelligence, that's cars driving by themselves, that's languages translating. Machine learning is the way we're training AI now using data. You might look at this and say, this is ridiculous. How else would you teach a computer without data? In the 1970s and 1980s, we had no data, so we use rules, rule-based AI. But now, obviously, it's much better, for example, to see what a doctor actually does than ask them what they're doing, right, for their strategy. So rules are out, data is in. And then, obviously, you have supervised and unsupervised, and most of what we're talking about here is supervised learning. We have a correct answer. We want the doctor or the radiologist or pathologist has the right answer. We want the computer to mimic that, of course. Unsupervised, we just want the data explained, clustered, made sense of. And then deep learning is obviously one type of machine learning, specifically a lot really tuned for images, nonlinear types of learning, crudely mimicking a brain. Let's see here. Okay, and all these are taking off. And I'm going to just focus on the product side of this because this is the EMA. These are the first three that I could see products now approved by the FDA in deep learning, specifically in cloud-based deep learning. So the computers aren't even on the hospital campus, and the deep learning means this is learning these nonlinear things, and as you've learned about, let's say in a less transparent way. Now the one in the back is Arteris, you might have talked about for cardiac imaging. Look at the date, January 2017. This is still a very new phenomenon. Viz AI for stroke triage. Where a patient comes into a hospital, we want to know if they should be triaged for stroke care and that pathway quickly. And then, of course, diabetic retinopathy. There are many groups around the world looking at pictures in the back of the eye, trying to diagnose diabetic retinopathy. And IDX, I think, was the first to get FDA approval. Of course, Google and many others are working on that. That was 2017. Fast forward to middle of 2019, here are 45 approved by the FDA. And all that you see the timeline on the left, and you can see all the areas of medicine on the right. So this is not just pathology and radiology. Now this is mid-2019, this is pre-pandemic. There's a nice article at this link. You all have the slides, you can look up all the links there. Now if you look just at the American College of Radiology, just radiology, over 100 approved by the FDA, okay, just in radiology. In fact, 75 of them approved last year during the pandemic, okay? So this is absolute acceleration. I've never heard of many of these companies or their products, but these are just FDA cleared AI algorithms in radiology, over 100. It's hard to keep the slide up to date. So obviously there's a phenomenon here. Now I'm going to structure my talk in these three covers. I know the previous speaker just showed these same covers because to me, it's a very big deal that the FDA puts out guidance like that, like this, even if it's in draft form. On the back is real world evidence. That's the collection of clinical data. I'm going to talk about that first. Then it's the generation of AI and machine learning as a medical device. Obviously, the data from the left goes into the AI into the middle. And then you have Digital Health Innovation Action Plan, which to me in particular is our ability now to do clinical trials on apps and software, and for us to even write a prescription for software. So I'm going to spend the last part talking about that. And to me, these three are actually written by separate groups at FDA, but there is a continuum between these three, okay? That we're starting with real-world clinical data, and we're ending with software as a prescription, as a therapeutic now, okay? And the AI is in between, bridging these two. All right, so most of my talk really focuses around electronic health record data, And I wanted to show you how much we've been spending in the United States. Here are 3 different health systems. Sutter, which is here in California, a major hospital system with clinics, spent $1 billion on their electronic health record system. Partners, which is Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and dozens of other affiliated hospitals in Boston, spent $1.2 billion on their electronic health record system. And Kaiser Permanente spent $4 billion on their electronic health record system. They're well known across the United States. Amazingly, they all bought the same system, Epic. So you can see the price tag ranges from $500 million, which is probably what we paid, to $4 billion for this data. And what I want to really communicate to you now is that, in my opinion, this is the most expensive data in America. We're paying doctors to type all of this in. And so the take-home narrative that I give out is it will be a national tragedy if after spending hundreds of billions of dollars, we don't use this data to improve the practice of medicine, okay? Of course, we need to do it safely, responsibly, respectfully. But if we don't use this expensive data to improve the practice of medicine, what a national tragedy this will be, having spent hundreds of billions of dollars. So that's the point I start with, that it's our duty to use this data to improve the practice of medicine. Otherwise, to be honest with you, why were we collecting all this in such an expensive way? Okay, it's our duty. And I don't mean just research duty, that I need to get a grant and write a paper about this. I think it's our operational duty as health systems to know what we're doing with patients, whether it's working or not, what's working, what's not working, and what's missing in medical care today. So with that, let me just introduce the University of California and why we believe we have something to say here. So the University of California is enormous. We have 10 campuses and 3 national labs, including Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which is the #1 supercomputer in the United States. We have 200,000 employees and 250,000 students per year. So we're one of the larger employers in the United States. We're not the largest, but we're one of the larger ones. And like everyone else, we're trying to figure out what to do with 250,000 students and 200,000 employees in the middle of COVID, obviously. So of our 10 campuses, within those campuses, we have 20 health professional schools, including 6 medical schools and 14 others. So that's pharmacy, nursing, dental, schools of public health, veterinary. That makes up the other 14 or so. And then 6 medical schools. We train half the medical students and residents in California. But even if they don't stay working for us, we have some influence. We get $2 billion in NIH funding. In fact, the University of California writes 10% of all publications in every field in the entire United States. Okay, that's how enormous we are. We make $13 billion a year seeing patients. 5,000 doctors get a paycheck from us every month. But 100,000 doctors write orders on our patients every year. That means residents, fellows, trainees, 12,000 nurses. And we're not just random centers. UCSF and UCLA, 2 of our medical centers, are in the US News top 10. We have 5 NCI Comprehensive Cancer Centers, 5 Clinical Translational Science Awards. And then we have these superpowers that we have. They're sometimes so secret superpowers, we forget we have them. IRB reliance, that means if any of our medical schools approves an IRB, the others more or less automatically approve it. And we can centralize contracting to speed the deployment of clinical trials that much faster. Now, I introduce all of this because in my view now, so we have this, you see the logo at the top, University of California Health. We now have all 6 of our academic medical centers sharing data every single month. We were happy with monthly, but now with COVID, we do this every single day. We put bulk data share. And in my view, this is the only instance in the United States where 6 academic medical centers share data with each other like this. All right. So where are we now? Just this as of a week or 2 or 3 ago. So we have the combined electronic health record data in one central database from UCSF, UCLA. Those are the 2 big ones. Irvine, Davis, San Diego, and Riverside. Riverside is tiny. It's brand new, couple thousand patients. The others have millions. The University of California has treated 15 million patients in the last 15 years. We like that number because it's 5% of the entire US population that we have data on. Now, if you count when we installed the most recent electronic health record system, Epic, that's what I've been talking about, we started in January 2012. So that's been about 9 years ago. If you count from then forward, we're just short of 7 million patients with what I'd call is so-called modern data. That means every pulse, every vital sign, every drug dose for those 7 million patients going back 9 years. So it's 205 million encounters, 500 million procedures, my favorite, 747 million medication orders or prescriptions, 680 million diagnosis codes, and 2 billion blood test results or vital signs. Another way I explain it is we have everything from Tylenol to CAR T cells. Tylenol for us is the brand name for acetaminophen, probably the cheapest thing we do for a patient. But of course, we have hundreds of patients treated with CAR T cells. That means we extract out their blood cells, teach it to fight cancer, and put them back in a patient. That is probably the most expensive thing we do for a patient. So it's not just primary care. We have everything in one database from the cheapest to the most expensive end of healthcare. With that, we mix in California regulatory data, Hodgepodge. We have pathology, radiology techs. We keep track of everyone who's died in the state of California, so what we call the death index. And all of this is harmonized continually because new drugs keep coming out every single week. So we have to make sure we're getting all the codes just right. We have dashboards on top of all of that here. But let me explain to you now, from that clinical data, let's get right into real world data. Why is real world data so exciting? Real world data, real world evidence. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here and show you what the power is. So this is just what the power is after a drug is approved. Now, at the top there, you see just one example, AbbVie, Humira, obviously well used around the United States, around the world. If you go way back to original Humira pivotal studies from the FDA, you can see it's approved for rheumatoid arthritis, RA, and inflammatory bowel disease, that's IBD. And I'm just showing you the 4 pivotal studies from their website. Premier was a 2-year double-blind study. You can see their total N was about 800 patients, 542 treated with Humira. DE019 had about 619 patients. The Classic 1 study had 299 patients. And the CHARM study, 56-week randomized double-blind study, had 854 patients. And just to be clear, not all of those hundreds of patients were actually treated with the drug. Okay, there was comparator arms there. Now the drug is approved, and now the University of California has treated over 10,000 patients with Humira. At a certain point, you might believe that we, as a health system, might know more about this drug than AbbVie does, because we've just treated so many more patients than they did in their pivotal studies. And our number continues to grow like crazy. Celgene, Revlimid, another great example. Randomized multi-center open label 3-arm trial, and was about 1,623, okay? It gets approved. University of California, 5,000 patients treated. And to be honest with you, this slide is a year old, okay? I don't have time to keep updating this slide. You can see 91,000 prescriptions or orders or doses. And then just to pick a more recent drug, Regeneron Praluent, this is for lipids. The Odyssey study had 2,341. This is an expensive drug. It's not really used that commonly. Already 1,300 patients treated. And again, this is as of last year. So at a certain point, we have all this data. We're just going to know a lot about these drugs in a way that the original pharma companies will not know. But I'm also going to posit or put out another question that I think it's our duty to answer. I think it's amazing that after drugs are approved or devices, okay, after drugs or devices are approved, in general, the health systems never bother to see if the drugs are working in their patients. That should be our duty to continually study this, to see, are our patients getting the same response that they got in their trials? It's amazing we don't do this routinely after approval. And I believe that we should be continually testing that. And by the way, if the data shows that our drugs aren't working as well as they thought they should, maybe we should even lower the price on some of them there. But this is the power of real world data. Now, we published a lot on this. We had a paper out in JCI on 21 uses of real world data, but I'm just giving you the idea that at a certain point, when you put all this data together, you're going to have more data than the pharma originator or the biotech originators. Now, with that, then we can use that data to answer its own questions or to train AI machine learning, okay? So I'm going to switch gears to now the middle chapter here, right? It's about training AI. Now, look, I know you guys have been talking about AI for many hours now, so I'm not going to go into details. Here's our contribution, but also illustrates a couple points. This was published now, I think, 2 years ago. This is using deep learning, so learning nonlinearities. And what we want to learn is if a patient comes in with rheumatoid arthritis, can we predict in 90 days what's going to happen to that patient? Are they going to have a flare? Because by the time they have a flare, then we're going to have to treat them, hit them hard with either steroids, up the dose of biologics. It'd be better in our view, in our hypothesis, to prevent that flare. But we need to predict the future. How do you do that? Well, here's an example where we use our UCSF data and then scaling to our other hospitals. And on the left, on the right side there, you see two panels. On the left, it's a ROC curve for our ability to predict in 90 days what the actual measure of clinical rheumatoid arthritis is. Now, that's great, but that's using more complete data in our academic health system. What happens to our neighboring hospitals, especially our safety net and county hospitals? And on the right there, you can see it's better than random, but it actually still works, okay? Now, that's going to be important because I think, and I think the previous speaker has been talking about this, you've probably been talking about this all day, we can't just test and train and validate in the same style of academic medical centers. We're going to have to train and test in and across multiple levels of health systems here, okay? For the wealthy, for the not wealthy. And that's why I love being in the University of California, because I think we treat the richest and poorest zip codes, our postal codes in California, for sure. I also like this because the diversity of the world is in California and is treated by the University of California. But if we don't see more of these graphs on the right, I think we're going to be doing our patients a disservice. We have to show that these algorithms work in other hospital systems, and more importantly, then use that to convince those hospital systems to get that data to then build a better model and to keep iterating those models there. But of course, it gets harder because each one of these versions of deep learning iterates so quickly. There's the regulatory aspect as well, as the previous speaker was talking about. Here's another example that we learned how to do with Google. Now, how do you do this when the health systems don't have the talent of an AI company or a tech company like Google or Apple or Microsoft, or dare I even say it, Facebook, okay? There is incredible talent there. Having seen that talent, I think I've learned it is going to be impossible for us as health systems to hire that level of talent, to keep those kinds of people even engaged in our health system. I can see the talent there. It's going to be hard. So at a certain point, we have to learn how to safely work with these companies. To us, we're at least benefiting that we've had now HIPAA for 22 years. But HIPAA isn't perfect because HIPAA protects us as providers and payers, but tech companies do not fall under HIPAA, okay? They're not what we call covered entities. What is the way that those companies are going to be governed for use of data? So at the very least, we can ensure legally that they're not going to even try to re-identify the patients if we de-identify the data. And that is something that we put into our agreements that people have written articles about, that we do this in a way that if we see evidence that they're trying to re-engineer or try to figure out who our patients are, that we will go after them legally. But what this means is also creating sandboxes and de-identification strategies. We have one, for example, for text notes that's incredibly hard to get working because the notes have hidden identifiers everywhere. But this is going to be a challenge because the health systems do not necessarily have the talent that other groups have, but they may not fall under the same principles of privacy. Now, you have GDPR, you have other carve-outs still for healthcare, and all of those are going to be country specific, and those are going to be issues. We have those just even within a neighborhood here, okay, that we have differences here. But this is going to be what's important here. We believe that we're doing this for the University of California, but we're still learning these lessons here. Now, going forward, where do I think AI is going to play a role? As you all know, we're continually trying to improve our health system, right? We should be using data to do that. And that's something that's been termed the learning healthcare system, okay? I believe, though, the learning healthcare system is actually still expert-driven. We need the expert to see something is wrong. We need the expert to propose a way to fix it. I believe now, and you can argue and you can criticize we don't have enough, but I believe we have enough data now, even for a computer to look at all of this and say, let the computer decide what needs to be improved here. And this circle can actually be started with the computer. I believe someday the computer is going to look at, for example, kidney transplantations and say, boy, you know, the computer has seen that these 10 patients keep doing poorly with this drug. Why don't we study this now across the other health systems? The computer should be able to suggest those hypotheses as we get more elements of the outcomes into this. Now, why do I believe this? Because this is what computers are great at doing in other venues, okay? And this is what AI is great at doing in other venues, especially playing games and chess and Go and all of those. I still believe medicine is not too dissimilar from these types of games and recreational activities for computers. I believe that this is going to happen It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. Because remember, computers keep getting powerful, more powerful. They double every 18 months or 2 years. Medical students do not double how smart they are every 2 years, right? Interns and residents don't double how smart they are every 2 years, but computers are doing that. And so it's only a matter of time. It's about us creating the framework that's going to make this acceptable now, right? Because you cannot deny it's going to happen. Again, I showed you 100 FDA-approved algorithms just in radiology so far. Most radiologists don't even know that in the United States. Now, of course, we have to be aware of the biases here. And we got to create a system that makes us aware of these biases. I'm just showing you 3 articles here that just in the past year. On the bottom left, there's one of our faculty at Berkeley. Notice that one of the popular, I don't know if algorithms are popular or not, but certainly a well-used algorithm from Optum to prioritize or to think about medical care or for payment or to predict how much a patient's going to cost next year is biased because the outcome they were using, the utilization of healthcare was also the measurement that they were using for training. You can't actually use it, can't do that way. And they showed, for example, that because certain socioeconomic classes, races and ethnicities delay their care or delay their access to medical care, that then shortens the amount of time they're actually being treated. That can bias these medical algorithms. We have in the non-medical field GPT-3, which is the latest text mining tool that's out there, a text analysis tool. Now it's sort of open, but it's also commercial. There's certain companies that have unique commercializability for GPT-3. But already we can see that if you train GPT-3 on random web pages from the internet, especially from Reddit and other, let's say, questionable websites, your model is going to be trained questionably. But what does it mean if we train a GPT-3 for healthcare data, right? Especially healthcare notes. We're trying that experiment now. We have 105 million notes de-identified now in the University of California, San Francisco. We're going to be trying to build that model to see, but we know it's going to be biased. How do we engineer the computer science here to make sure that it's not, or to make sure that we can't do this and then tell the world that we can? And at the bottom right, this is a struggle. Ethical AI is an incredible struggle. It goes beyond transparency here. And of course, companies like Google AI and others are having a big problem with this right now, as their talent is actually starting to be more public with how biased these algorithms are. I believe this has just started. Now, let me just make this crystal clear, right? We're looking at sophisticated algorithms here, but remember, what is an algorithm, right? Would I call a linear regression machine learning? I don't know anymore, right? Or to make this even more concrete, look how we're thinking we're going to prioritize ventilators during the COVID crisis, right? Obviously, we all have hospitals that are trying to prioritize ventilators. You know, there's thankfully fewer than more. But in general, they're using these algorithms to try to predict how well a patient might do. And one that's being commonly used is called the SOFA score. In fact, the eSOFA score. Now, SOFA goes back more than a decade, okay? Does anyone even look to see how that crude algorithm was trained? I've looked up the original papers, right? Did they even report on race and ethnicity, socioeconomic stats, right? Some of the most common algorithms that we use have none of that documented. And of course, papers showing that these are biased. So I don't think we need computers and black boxes to say that's an algorithm, but we've been using algorithms in medicine for decades here, and they are already questionable. So we should be looking at what's already there too, not just what's coming in the front door. That's what proper stewardship would look like here. How were those algorithms trained? So in an effort to try to make more of this happening, we got together with a whole bunch of AI creators in the United States and some around the world to put out this minimum information center. Now, about science, we've seen in the past 20 years that these minimum information papers have had a world of difference. And what we're saying here, and I'll show you the checklist in a moment, that if one is going to release an AI tool for medicine, especially clinical care, okay, and I'm not talking about testing the AI, I'm saying the development and the production of that AI, we believe there's a minimum checklist that we should all be able to see followed so we can properly evaluate this. And that means looking at the test data, the training data, the validation strategy, all of that. And I'm not going to go into the paper in detail. This was in Nature Medicine I think less than a year ago. And here's this example of what the checklist looks like here. So it's a question clearly formed. What stage was the question decided? Was it before the data was collected or after the data was collected? And on and on. So I believe we're going to see more of these. In fact, this paper came out with 2 other groups. I think it's Spirit and Consort had their publication guidelines for the testing or the validation of AI algorithms. So all 3 made up a set of papers in Nature Medicine. Now, of course, as they say, here's yet another standard. And the best thing about standards are there's so many of them. We're not really saying this is a standard, this is a checklist. We've seen journals take these types of checklists before. We're hoping journals in this field start to use a checklist like this as well. Now, just to finish up here, what does it mean? So that means the outbound creation of AI, putting it out there. What about the inbound use of AI? And we believe that right now, like I said, with SOFA scores, with radiology algorithms, we believe AI tools are coming in, models and machine learning models are coming into health systems, and physicians, doctors don't even know about it. And we believe there's a case to steward these algorithms. So what does stewarding mean? When a drug is approved and a health system decides to put it on their formulary, right? Let's say an expensive biologic or expensive small molecule. A committee, let's say the Pharmaceutical and Therapeutics Committee, P&T committee, would look at that drug, decide to put it on the formula, look at the evidence, and then monitor its use for a year. Okay, right? Is the drug being used properly? Is the drug being overused? Are we seeing any effect from that drug? Right? Those committees are set up in the United States in health systems to monitor drugs as they're coming onto the formulary because they're required to do this. That is an output, that is a requirement, a mandate from the Joint Commissions for the Accreditation for Healthcare Organizations, or JCAHO. So we have to have a process to steward the inbound use of drugs and devices. But what about AI? Why don't we have such a stewardship process for artificial intelligence and machine learning models? And so in this paper, which came out in JAMA, you see the link at the bottom there, we propose using the same exact model we use for drugs and devices for AI. What does a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial look like for AI? Well, maybe it's safety and of efficacy and fairness. Maybe we should be evaluating those in earlier stage trials. We have a formulary that scales up the drugs and devices. We now need an algorithm inventory that also serves as the formulary for AI. We have medication use evaluations that are strictly and formally done by hospital systems. We need algorithm ones as well. And then there's ongoing oversight. For example, as bacteria, local resistance patterns change, we're required to update those antimicrobial resistance patterns and make sure physicians are aware of that and healthcare providers are aware of that. We should also have that similar algorithm steward role. For example, if my hospital system changes the CAT scan or CT or the MRI from one vendor to another, is that going to mess up the AI and machine learning? Who's even in the health system to know that right now, right? It is altogether possible that AI machine learning has learned some minor little artifact of the AI, of the CT or MRI that's completely thrown off when a new vendor or a new model comes in. So there's going to be an ongoing role to monitor these algorithms. If we don't do this, we're being not just sloppy, but we're going to be doing a disservice to our patients and potentially even being harmful to patients. So we're not saying this is going to be crazy, but we already do this for drugs. We do this for devices. Let's think about how to do this for AI as well. In the final moment, now the last chapter, I'm only going to show one slide here, I think, is now we got the data, okay? Now we got the AIs built. Now we're going to start to deliver this to patients. I think the deployment of clinical data to patients is revolutionary. Many health systems in the United States give out raw clinical data in a federal standard called FHIR directly to patients on their smartphones. I think the next generation of AI decision support is going to be patient-facing, not doctor-facing, because now we have thousands, soon millions of patients looking at their medical records on their phone. What are they going to do with that data? I believe there are going to be new apps that they're going to be able to install. Some are going to be branded with hospital systems to tell and counsel that patient what to do with this data or that data, or what to do with their medical care. Already now in the United States, we can write a prescription for therapeutics, digital therapeutics, that is. Here's the table we put out. This paper just came out I think this is in NPJ Digital Medicine. You see the link at the bottom there. Pear Therapeutics, WellDoc, Achille has their, I think, the first video game now for attention deficit or autism, major depression they're working on. And so you can see some are in trials, some are actually released. I think there are about 20 or so on this list, and this is also starting to skyrocket. That we will have digital therapeutics. But to me, remember, I think many people look at these as three separate problems or challenges. I see a continuum here, starting with the data we already have, training AI machine learning, some of which is going to be deployed directly to patients. That challenge exists across all three of these here. So I think I'm going to end with the same slide I showed at the beginning. These are the three areas separately considered by the US FDA. I see this as being connected. And what an amazing time it is to be an innovator in this space. It's going to happen, okay? All of these things, computer and digital, double, triple every 2 to 3 to 4 years. Medicine hasn't been growing that fast, that well. It's only a matter of time. Let's make sure we are part of the solution on this. Because I believe if we as health systems and doctors and software engineers in our academic systems, if we don't engineer these things, we're going to be stuck buying them someday. So let me just stop there and see if there's questions. See if that was at all useful to any of you.
Thank you, Atul. It was certainly very, very interesting, very stimulating. And I really thank you. I can't thank you enough for this very stimulating talk. And I see, Lisbeth, you have already been extremely busy answering questions in the chat. So, Atul, I see a very interesting question from Inka Heikkinen. Maybe, Inka, you can just briefly introduce your questions that deals with if you have actually trained an algorithm based upon a randomized controlled clinical trial and you deploy it on real-world evidence data, it doesn't always deliver the same results. So what is your perspective on this? And perhaps, Inka, you want to elaborate a little bit on this.
Thank you, Nikolai, so much for letting me speak a little bit. So we have actually, in our company, we have actually did some testing based on the data, on the RCT data, and develop an algorithm. And when we deployed the same algorithm into real-world evidence, there was actually bias in the health record data. So we saw slightly different results. So I was just interested when you were saying that perhaps as the AI gets, as there's more and more data and the payers get more and more data, that they could make different decisions to the developers. So I was just interested to hear your thoughts about the bias and how you would want to work with the developers in the future to kind of be able to get accurate results also. Thank you.
Yeah, so your question is great. I'm going to make a couple points here. Thank you for the question. So first of all, I'm a big believer in the electronic health record data side of it, less so on the claims data side, okay? Look, you're right. Claims data is great, and a lot of people have been building models for claims data for a long time. But first of all, I'm going to say it's less complete data, right? We get all the details. Now, a lot of those details are in the clinical notes. And so I think we're going to be building tools to extract more information from clinical notes to teach these algorithms to make them better. What I'll say, though, is yes, AI does not work in some real-world evidence studies, just like drugs don't always work in real-world evidence studies. I don't think we're always going to get the same results from a clinical trial on a drug or a small molecule like we do in our patients. More data. So why is it different, right? So clinical trials typically collect more data on the participants. In fact, one could say excessively so much data, because when you look at how those patients are actually treated after approval, the physicians barely collect any of that data or even document it. One great example for biologics, let's pick an expensive category, are endoscopies for inflammatory bowel disease, right? How many clinical trials we can look and see have a Mayo score computed on those patients? Physicians don't compute a Mayo score. They don't even get all the categories that are behind the Mayo score when they're treating patients. So we're trying to extract more from our clinical trial. We have a deep learning methodology we're trying to work out that looks at an endoscopy report and computes the Mayo score, even though the doctor's not doing it. But in the end, people say all the time, electronic health record data is messy data, okay? Now, I think it's absolutely false. It's a messy world, and the EHR data is beautiful data capturing that messy world. So the short answer is that we don't treat patients the same way as we do study participants. And that's why I think there's a lot of data that's not matching. It happens to be missing. the models aren't working in the real world.
Thank you very much, Atul. That's a really, really interesting perspective, and I think it's very true. We do have a question for Lisbeth from Enrico Glab, who is asking, are there any standards or recommendations on how to ensure that machine learning or simulation models are sufficiently interpretable or explainable? Lisbeth, perhaps you can just quickly answer that.
I would actually want to pass this question on to the experts on machine learning and AI, because that's not what I am. I'm just representing the digital community here, but in general, but not specifically. So I think maybe Atul has, with this knowledge of he might know the FDA better, and they might. I know they have presentations. I've seen presentations on that, but I don't know how far they actually are in terms of standards or recommendations.
Yeah, I don't know. So the latest details, but I think so many of these are in draft form. I think there's proposed frameworks now, and they're open for public comment. I missed the actual first part of the question, but maybe you could repeat the question then. I didn't realize it was coming to me.
No. Are there any standards or recommendations on how to ensure that machine learning or simulation models are sufficiently interpretable or explainable?
Yeah, the explainability. And okay. So that's a great question. I think there's some paragraphs, for example, in some of these frameworks, but there are no standards in that space right now. So we've put out our checklist. If you want to call that a standard, you can say that's a standard. There's some reporting guidance now from Spirit, from Consort and Spirit. You could call those standards, but they're really guidelines. But my understanding from the FDA side is that there are currently no requirements for how these should be explained. They should be documented, they should be in trials, but how much of the black box is open? When I last looked at these, there's no standard there.
Thank you very much. I think we're almost out of time, but one last question for you, Atul. Do you think, from Sebastian Fischer, do you think that algorithmic stewardship needs to be fundamentally different to existing pharmacovigilance and post-marketing surveillance frameworks, or can concepts and infrastructure be reused?
I think the concept and frameworks can be reused. That's exactly why we wrote that paper for JAMA. So at UCSF, we literally have an algorithms monitoring committee. It functions just like the hospital's P&P committee, but just for algorithms. So if we want to deploy a tool, let's say in the electronic health record for doctors, it must go through this committee for evaluation upfront and then ongoing evaluation. So absolutely, I believe that these are going to be there. But think about it this way, right? The chief pharmacy officers, usually in a health system, are the ones that manage those medication committees. Who is it that's going to be responsible for the algorithm committees? Is it the CIO of the hospital? I don't think so. I don't think they're that medically aware. So there's someone there. I hesitate to use the phrase chief AI officer. I don't want to use that phrase. But think about it, that role, that committee, that reporting structure does not typically exist in a health system right now. Who would be managing those committees? Who would they report to? So I think yes, we're going to reuse some constructs, but I think that responsibility is a new responsibility. It might need to be newly created.
Thank you so much, Atul, for this message, and I completely agree with you. We started 15 minutes late. We end 15 minutes late. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lisbeth. Thank you, Atul, for this. If you want to hang on for a few minutes and perhaps answer questions in the Q&A, that would be highly appreciated. I've just heard from Luis that we will capture all the questions and answers from the Q&A and circulate them after the meeting, so nothing will be lost there. But with that, perhaps, Saida, I can hand over to you, who will be moderating the next session. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As head of the Digital Business Transformation Task Force at the EMA, I'm of course very pleased to be moderating this session on the application of AI in medicines and in medicines regulation. Let me start also by a few housekeeping points. So for this session, we propose that the discussion will actually take place after the 5 talks. And you've seen already how to submit your question and answers in the question and answers indent here as per the other session. And we are also proposing that you add potentially the stakeholder group and your affiliation. Then in terms of the proceedings for the questions, we will select a number of questions and ask actually the person to raise them. So we will unmute you and actually allow you to raise the question to the panelists. And with this, I would like to say that the session itself will look at different uses of AI from different angles. It will look, for example, at the use of AI in drug development, including clinical trial design or qualifications, but also, for example, the use of AI across the life cycle of medicines, and, for example, also tackle post-market surveillance. Another interesting aspect as part of this session is that you will also hear how industry and regulators are looking into reducing administrative burdens through the use of the process analytics, AI, and automation, so as to allow for the resources to look at where it matters most. Now, to bring this session to life, we've lined up for you a series of absolutely excellent speakers that will each and every one of them share their experiences and view, and to provide you, I would say, an enriching set of talks, I have no doubt. And so to get the session going, I would like to ask the first speaker is Lucy Gatpai from WHO. Lucy, you are the head of data science at the Uppsala Monitoring Center, and you will talk about the novel methods in pharmacovigilance use cases in VGBase. Please, I don't know if you managed to have your presentation uploaded from your side. Yes, it looks like it works. Please, Lucy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I hope you can see my slides.
We can see your slides and we hear you well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. This has been a fantastic workshop so far, and we have already seen many use cases of AI methods throughout the entire healthcare landscape. My presentation is focused on a much smaller part of the puzzle, which is drug safety. But as recent events surrounding COVID-19 vaccines show, it's an important part of the healthcare puzzle. I will focus on use cases for 3 new methods that we have developed at the Uppsala Monitoring Center that make use of machine learning techniques and statistics to advance the science of pharmacovigilance. I apologize in advance for all the pharmacovigilance jargon for those that are not really familiar with the field. Let's dive in. So a little bit about UMC for those that don't know about us. So it's not the same UMC as Andre Decker. This is the Uppsala Monitoring Center. We are an independent non-profit foundation established in 1978. We oversee the technical and scientific operations of the WHO Program for International Drug Monitoring. We're the custodian and manager of VGBase, the WHO database of reports of side effects of medicines, and this is really the core of our data. We're also the developer of WHO Drug Global. It's the world's most widely used drug dictionary. We're self-funded, and our vision is a world where patients and healthcare providers make wise therapeutic decisions. So our relationship to WHO, we are a WHO collaborating center in relation to this program for international drug monitoring. The board of UMC is composed of WHO and Swedish government representatives. We share WHO vision of better health for all, but organizationally and scientifically, we're independent from WHO. The WHO Program for International Drug Monitoring was first piloted in 1968 with 10 countries participating. As you can see in this map, the program has now an extensive coverage with 143 countries being full member. And it's not just a program that has grown over time quite dramatically, it's also VGBase, our database, as you can see in this bar chart. If the rate of reporting remains constant throughout 2021, we can clearly expect the growth to continue in what looks like an exponential trend. So VGBase, being so big and having such an extensive coverage in terms of country, it clearly has an important role to play in the pharmacovigilance landscape. VGBase provides unique opportunities for data mining and statistical signal detection. For decades, UMC has been developing new methods for pharmacovigilance using all kinds of data sources. So VigiBase, of course, but also electronic health records, social media, and addressing different kinds of challenges, for example, so duplicate detection, statistical signal detection, temporal pattern discovery in longitudinal data, to cite only a few. But today, I would like to show you 3 new methods that UMC has developed recently. All of them can be used to mine VigiBase to find interesting patterns. The first one is called VigiPoint and is a statistical approach to highlight the striking differences between 2 sets of reports. The second is a clustering method to identify sets of clinically coherent pictures of reports. And finally, I will present a new data-driven way to present drugs and MedDRA preferred terms. So let's start with VigiPoint. Let's imagine that you have a set of reports that you're interested in, let's say reports from Europe, and you would like to know at a quick glance what features are standing out in this particular set of interests compared to a comparator set, in this case, the rest of the world. What VigiPoint does is to basically perform a large amount of disproportionality analysis. We look at all kinds of possible covariates of interest, like patient, age, sex, reporter type, seriousness of reports, drugs, reactions, etc. And then we perform disproportionality analysis within all the values these covariates can take. So we would have one score for the 18 to 44 years old value. The metric we chose for this is a bit akin to the information component, disproportionality measure that we use a lot at UMC, but it's based on the odds ratio and it has this adaptive shrinkage. I will not go in more details than this. I'll point to more reference at the end of my presentation. So we then obtain a score for each age group, one score for each sex, for each reporter type, etc. So this leads to a very large list of score, which can then be ordered as we see fit. So typically by effect size or significance or a combination of both. The number of tests performed in one single VigiPoint analysis is large, so typically in the order of thousands or tens of thousands. The credibility intervals, the adaptive shrinkage, and some significance threshold have been designed to limit these spurious associations related to highly multiple testing. Nonetheless, VigiPoint should not be considered as a proper multiple testing method, but rather as a way to get a quick glance of the characterizing features and to generate hypotheses about the set of interests that will require further digging into. And here are some results, actually, fresh off the computer. We made this VigiPoint 2 weeks ago to the reports received from UDRA Vigilance between 2010 and 2020. And here are just the top highlighted features. We see here that few things stand out for being more often observed in the UDRA Vigilance reports than the rest of VigiBase. And it's high report completeness, reports originating from physicians, and then particular drugs, bisoprolol, ramipril, levothyroxine. I hope you find this interesting. It makes me want to dig into the data and understand why. Now, onto the second method, clustering method. In a large database, such as VigiBase, detecting signals can look a little bit like this. I spared you the stereotypical image of the needle in the haystack, but the feeling is really the same. How do we tease apart patterns in the data that can be indicative of a previously unknown safety issue in this vast ocean of reports? Traditionally, statistical signal detection has most often been conducted on the level of drug-event combinations. We look at all kinds of drug-event combinations observed in safety reports to tease apart the signals from the noise or other confounding non-causal effects. And there are many such drug-event combinations to consider. VigiBase today contains more than 3.5 million possible drug event combinations. So traditional disproportionality analysis has been used as an effective way to rank the multitude of these combinations and focus on what is more likely to be something real. But addressing signal detection in that way is not without limitations. One major limitation is that by using single terms only, disproportionality can ignore the more complex picture of the clinical manifestations of the adverse drug reactions. So imagine a case with these three terms, vomiting, headache, abnormal vision. Taking one concept at a time and assess them separately makes it much harder to see the bigger picture. A single term might get an entirely different interpretation depending on context. So let's take vomiting, for example. Here we have two cases with vomiting as a term. On the first case, the patient was experiencing vomiting in the context of gastrointestinal reaction, while the second patient most likely experienced a strong migraine. In this case, we would not want to just look at how likely the drug is to have caused vomiting, but how likely the drug is to have caused these two given distinct clinical pictures, a set of terms that together describe how the patient reacted to the drug. And this is what we propose, a new and probably complementary way to mine for safety issues in Vigibase. Instead of one single term, we can look at the entire set of case reports for that drug and then cluster the reports based on all the reaction terms they contain. And by summarizing the distribution of the reaction terms found on the reports in these clusters, we can hopefully build a clinical picture for the drug that makes sense. The technical details on how we do the clustering is, of course, out of scope here, but I'll point you to references at the end. And we have developed a browser to look at the cluster results to allow us to have a much more in-depth look at the clusters. We have also developed visualizations to see how the cluster relates to one another in a given data set. So all of this is very much still in the evaluation phase. And we talked about this. Evaluation validation is really critical and sometimes very difficult. And in this case, evaluation is by nature very tricky because there is no gold standard or truth to this approach. But when we applied this methodology to the COVID-19 vaccines, we have seen some very interesting aspects in the data which have then led to deeper investigation. So this approach might be in the future integrated into Visualize. It's one of our products that used to be browsing Vigibase, and it will allow Visualize users to look at their data in a totally different way. So exciting future ahead. Let's leave this clustering topic and move on to our last new method, the data-driven representations of drugs and MedDRA terms, what we usually refer to as vectors. The graph that you see here on the slide is actually a great segue to introduce the topic. As I told you, this graph is a visualization of clusters and how clusters relate to one another. So each cluster is like a point with similar clusters have coordinates which place them in similar regions of the graph. But how did we choose those coordinates? How could we place the clusters so that their placement actually carries meaning about them? Well, that is all thanks to the vectors. So what are the vectors? Simply put, vectors are just sets of numbers, coordinates, if you will, which places each drug and each MedDRA PT in a space which has meaning. How did we make these these vectors? We actually used an algorithm which is widely used in natural language processing. In NLP, researchers have looked for ways to make representations of words that would carry meaning and have developed algorithms to create so-called semantic spaces. A semantic space is a space where each word in the vocabulary gets a vector representation, a set of coordinates, which carries meaning about the word itself. The meaning can be understood by looking at the kind of neighboring words you find associated with it. The most popular algorithm for this is word2vec, and it's applied on huge amount of text to learn these vector representations. Now we can do the same. We can apply this machine learning algorithm on our data. VGBase is so large that we can take all the reports, treat the drugs and the reactions found on them as words, and use word2vec to build a semantic space for these drugs and reactions, all in a completely data-driven manner. And I can imagine that this is totally possible to do as well in electronic health records and all kind of big data. So these new representations have several interesting applications. So first, it's important to understand that it's a paradigm shift in representing drugs and MedDRA terms, which up until now could only be represented using a hierarchy, such as MedDRA, of course, but also ATC for the drugs, or discrete groupings like the SMQs or the WHO drug standard drug groupings. Using a continuous space, we can access a much more nuanced definition of similarity and relatedness. For example, here you can see top 10 neighbors of 3 different concepts in this space. As the distance increases, the similarity or relatedness of the neighbors to that concept decreases as well, which validates this approach. And this space has been built in a completely data-driven manner. The second interesting application is visualization. Now that we have coordinates, we can use these representations to do all kinds of plots. So cluster plot that I showed you before, but also plots like this one. This is what we call a bubble graph. It shows at a glance the reporting pattern of a drug of interest. So here, methyldopa. Each bubble is a reaction that has been reported with the drug. The size of the bubble reflects the number of reports for that drug event combinations. And the color is indicative of disproportionality, with red being highly disproportional. So since the coordinates place similar things together, we can quickly see if there are regions that are actually lighting up. So in this case, there are definitely interesting regions that we would want to look at. And to satisfy your curiosity, I've marked them to see what they represent. And it seems like it's a lot of known side effects and also things related to indication. A third interesting application is that now we can compute the distance between any 2 drugs and any 2 reactions. And this means we can integrate additional information into our statistical screening. So for example, here are the most disproportional reaction to drug A in VGBase. And here are the labeled reactions extracted from the drug label. We can now compute the distance between all the reactions highlighted by disproportionality, those on the right, and all the labeled reactions, those on the left. We can then decide if a certain distance to at least one labeled reaction is small, then we flag the reaction as known, or we actually deprioritize it from our list. So on this example, we would deprioritize like skin toxicity, infusion-related reaction, skin fissures, acne pustular, blood magnesium decreased, and pharyngeal inflammation. So this could make statistical screening of drug event combinations much more efficient. If novel, not novel aspect, but if novel, previously unknown safety issues is what we're after. So we're now arriving at the end of my presentation. There are many more projects going on at UMC, which have some AI, machine learning, NLP, statistics basis. So I cannot resist listing them here in case any of them catch your interest. And in such case, you're very welcome to get in touch. We have done some work around mappings. So from free text descriptions of reactions to MEDRA using deep learning. We have also launched a drug coding engine using AI. It's called CODA. We have some NLP projects going on. So Atul was talking about the identification. We're working on that for narratives so that they could be shared in the future. We're working on mining the DailyMed SPLs since they are open for adverse events and also indication, and in the future, all kinds of information can be found there, and some statistical projects as well. So here are the references that I promised you I will give you. So if you're interested, take a screenshot. Now is the time. And with that, I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for a most interesting presentation. I will move swiftly on to the next talk, which will actually be a tandem of EMA colleagues, Joachim Berenger and Florence Butlen. Kim Berenger is a data scientist in the Analytics Center of Excellence of my task force, and Florence is a clinical psychiatrist in the Neurological and Psychiatric Disorders office at EMA. Kim, please, and Florence on the use of AI and digitalization at the EMA. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Zaid, and thank you. My name is Kim, and I'm going to present today how we work with AI and digitalization and EMA, and how we see the digitalization journey at the agency. Then I will give the floor to my colleague, Florence, to explain about applications of AI in medicines and medicine circulation. Let's start. So how we see the digitalization journey and what we do to achieve our goals. We have, under the Digital and Analytics Solution Service, we have 4 main areas. We have the process and reengineering for digital. It means that before implementing any digital solution or build it, we need to rethink the process. We cannot implement a new digital solution or build it if we don't recreate or rethink the entire process. So that is the purpose of that area, is to see how, what, and when we are going to implement a digital solution or an AI-specific solution. The second, to achieve our goals, what we do is to try to see and scan out in the market what is the best solution that fits our purpose. For that, we are going to a selection process from a proof of concept phase, pilot phase, and then the final implementation, trying to analyze what is the best solution that we can implement to achieve our goals. If we cannot find that solution, or we think that it's better to develop our own solution because our requirements are specific for EMA needs, we have a team that is the Analytics Center of Excellence who build and develop such applications. We develop applications, APIs, and other functionalities that can be integrated in other platforms or systems at EMA. I will explain later some of them and in more detail. And then the final area is how to explore novel technologies available in the market, is to scan for promising novel digital solutions on the market and how we can implement at the agency in the near future. So it's to create the demand that we see that business can bring an EMA business value. All these areas are delivered through the Digital Innovation Lab, who organize the work and prioritize the task and the projects based on requirements and priorities. But as I said before, we have the Analytics Center of Excellence who build their own applications. EMA has its own group that explore how process analytics, including artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, can be used to build pragmatic solutions to EMA business needs, with our main objective to gain efficiency. And what are these process analytics at the EMA? So basically, as a regulatory agency, we receive thousands of documents. So we need to focus our energy to apply AI methodologies, AI and process improvements to these documents. Some of these methodologies are natural languages processing methodologies that we implement to extract content of the document, extract information, extract entities, categorize and clustering the content to be analyzed afterwards in our processes. We also build document processing. We develop processes to analyze the type of documents that we receive and assess its content to notify it to the specific assessor in the specific process. And in those documents, we only not have text, we also have images and charts. So we implement OCR methodologies to read images, charts, and to analyze the content and extract all the needed information. Some of those examples are the ones that are listed here. And I will explain a little bit three of them, our main projects. The first one is the system validation system. This system is to support the validation of variations. And what does it do? It flags missing documents in the application, detects dissimilarities between information submitted by applicants and data stored in our databases, identify any changes made by applicants in the documents submitted, and this is with all EU languages. Also, we can compare the version that has been submitted with previous versions and what is the change that has been submitted by the company. A second application is the personal data recognition. This application flags personal data into documents. It searches personal data and highlights personal data for human review. It supports the assessment of different documents when we need to redact certain kind of information. We apply AI and models not only to identify this personal data, also to improve the accuracy of the system. So every time that the system is used by a user, it improves their accuracy and helps better to the system. A third one is the document comparison. This is a system to compare leaflet and labeling documents. Identify the content of package leaflet and labeling documents of companies submitted to EMA. And we see the difference between the originator EPAR document. It analyzes the text included and all the images, and also is available for all the 25 languages in the EU. There is not only these three projects, also we have other list of ongoing projects, as you can see here. We have also automatic triage system, where we apply text analytics to analyze the content of the queries that EMA receive through our portal and triage automatically for a specific department. Also, we are checking the document packages review, that we review all the documentations that companies submit in a package. And then a third one, the literature review. We analyze the abstracts for literature monitoring to include or exclude these documents based on different criteria of inclusion and exclusion. But not only at EMA AI is for process analytics. We also apply AI for healthcare data analytics, where our main objective is of the analysis of data. The main objective of this service is to understand how AI and machine learning can help and support to extract and expose messy data and achieve deeper analysis into healthcare data. Some of the examples of those activities are listed here in this table. For example, the first one, mining and structured data. This is to automate the update of the database of ADRs of CAPs and exposing the results. One of the advantages of this system is that it decreases the manual labor and improve access to the data. Another activity is to duplicate detections. We have developed an algorithm to identify duplicate reports in user vigilance. Over more than 1 million has been confirmed using this algorithm. The advantage is that this decreases the workload and it provides more accurate information. Another one is the characterizing opioid abusers. The characteristic of the description of this activity is that this is the analysis of clusters of abuse of prescription opioids. And the advantage or the benefits is that characterize who is at risk of abuse and understand effects of covariance. And then the last one is the classifying patients. It predicts genotype using a Bear reactions data, and it helps to better estimate of public health impact of ADRs. And until here, my slides explaining AI and digitalization at EMA. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Florence for the next topic.
Thank you very much, Joachim. So yeah, my name is Florence Butland. So yeah, I work in the Human Medicine Division. So as such, I'm going to briefly give you an overview of the application of AI in medicines and medicine regulation. So lots of questions. I'm sorry, we have to be very humble. So just to say where we are, what we have seen at the agency, where we are going, what is likely to come, and what is next, or what we could think of to try to progress with this fast-moving digital field. So definition of AI as proposed by the high-level expert group by the Commission. So I'm not going to read it loud, but just to emphasize the complexity of the definition. And it was earlier discussed that problem definition is key. And it is indeed, because it's a multifactorial concept, and it's complex because of the different nature of the definition in itself, being not only technological, but also scientific, ethical, personal at different level, and obviously clinical also. Here on this slide, you can see again the complexity of AI and health. Well, many options in terms of tools, but also in terms of implication for health. And we've seen that it's not that clear-cut, as some of those tools are intricated. For example, you can have a biomarker with an algorithm that can be used both to enrich a population in a clinical trial setting, but also to be used for therapeutic needs, like better treatment or better diagnosis. So we need to understand how they are intricated, and which model can be used for which tools and which goal. And maybe there are different models for different combination. It's something that is to be defined. Medical device software, it's one of the options and one of the tools that now we see more and more. So before we had a traditional drug device combination. So for example, you would have an inhaler with a medicine to treat a certain respiratory disease. And now build up, you have a digital tool that can help to provide additional information, clinical information, as a patient taken the medicine as should be. What about the administration? What about the compliance? The medical device software can be used in itself without a treatment to help physicians to make a diagnosis with some imaging techniques. And it's also here important to have a clear definition of what it is and in which framework we are. And if you're interested, there is this fact sheet on a medical device software that has been published by the Commission recently, and which helped to answer the question, is my software, your software, a medical device? So what we have seen at the EMA so far, well, from the Human Medicine Division, we see product under development and also under evaluation, and variation in the post-marketing phase. So it's a variety of tools and digital methods. But what is important is that we are approached more and more by developers and also learned societies to come and discuss in different platforms about how to help to understand the framework, the definition, what is important in terms of development and evaluation. We are also participating in a number of initiatives like the IMI sprints or proactive projects. So we have a published a Q&A that is on the website on the qualification of those digital technology-based methodologies. And here, I mean, it's an extract of this Q&A just to emphasize that at the very end, we will be looking at clinical data. We will be looking at data that are to support the benefit risk assessment overall of the product that we are assessing. And here there are many aspects to consider again, and many challenges. So first of all, it's quite important, I would think, and it has been said previously, that we are a bit in an unknown territory. So it's a great opportunities, but many challenges. And for previous traditional treatment, if I may say, we will have a certain set of standards. We will have preclinical testing, clear or satisfactorily clear enough mechanism of action. But PK data, here we don't know. There is no such a thing as a digital mechanism of action. For how long does this new tool have to be applied, and at which frequency? Those algorithms, I think it has been touched upon before, but they need to be validated and tested. What about their accuracy, their reliability, their sensitivity to change? In terms of methodological aspects, the questions that we may ask ourselves are also about the comparator, how to design a digital sham, how to power a study, what will be our endpoint or effect size, and one very important point, the clinical relevance of the improvement. What is the clinical added value for the patients compared to what the traditional medicines or tools were already providing? And how to monitor safety, I think that has been also nicely addressed before. So overall, at the very end, the large volume of data that is going to be generated, both through an algorithm process data, we need to understand how we can best use them, and how many data do we need, and at which frequency again. And in terms of statistical method, is there any best tool to really convert the data into something of clinical value? So these are many questions, and these are the type of questions that we ask ourselves when we have to assess the benefit risk overall of a new product using a digital tool. So some very key aspects that I believe based on what we have seen would be important to consider for the future is, again, the definition, the scope. There are many different ways of designing and considering those new tools. We need to be sure that we speak the same language. I think at some point in the workshop today, there was something about algorithm, and can the algorithm be really trusted across countries, across departments, and that's the type of question we need to answer. And this has to be an interactive and collaborative effort. So that's why in platform we discuss with stakeholders like industry, patient representative. Very important to understand what is the clinical relevance of those new tools, what could they bring for the patients, and the trust. Trust is very important. It has been said many times today, and the system needs to be based on trust, and trust of the patients, first of all, I would think. Science, regulatory science, research to understand better what is needed, how to fill the gaps between the what is needed from the medical side and what the technology can offer. But for that, we need to engage with academia, with research, and to also for ourselves to continue this regulatory science initiative and strategy. So it's to finish an interactive, I would think, a process that when the data are out there, they can also feed back the model, and they can help adjusting the model. So we have an opportunity to use the real world data to adjust the system that will help us even more to fit this purpose. So I would just finish for now, and I'm very happy to answer any question in the Q&A or any other moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim and Florence, for giving some insights on what's happening on the AI area at EMA. For sake of time, I move on swiftly. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Kair El-Sarat from the FDA. Kair is Deputy Director in the Office of Medical Policy at CDER FDA. You will present to us the AI in therapeutic development and provide us a policy perspective. Please, Kair, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for actually organizing this meeting. I think we need more conversations around this topic. I appreciate our colleagues at the EMA and everybody else who presented. Actually, you're going to see a little bit of an overlap with some previous presentations. So for the sake of time, I might go over some of the slides a little bit fast and take questions and then rather than focusing on them. I'm hoping for today to go over 4 key areas, hopefully to convince you that the AI is a part of a whole changing ecosystem that we all have to be responsive to. And AI is one aspect of that. I want to highlight that AI utilization really crosses therapeutic areas. I know historically we think of devices, combination products, and drugs and biologics. I think this is increasingly an area that's going to push us to collaborate more and work more together across therapeutic areas. I'm going to leave you with some new ideas and new actually initiatives around policy and operational applications that FDA is trying to address. And also I have some kind of questions similar to the previous presenter on like questions for collectively for the community and how we try to move forward in this area. So I think the way we see AI as very much an integrated aspect across the board in an ecosystem that's evolving really fast. And this is including the digitization that we see around us across the board from healthcare to therapeutic development, but also different tools and advancing evidence generation paradigm, as we've heard, for example, around real-world data and the work around this available data around us that we really need to make sense of and think how we can utilize for the benefit of public health in general. And I think that's a challenge that really goes across the board. Match that also with the innovations that we're seeing in clinical trial designs. A lot of this is really catalyzed by what around the pandemic that's going to push us to move faster even. Think of decentralization around clinical trial that's really facilitated by digitization, but also adaptability and innovations around clinical trial design at large. So this is very much the ecosystem, and this is just a few parts of it that I think we should think about it collectively. Now, you've seen some of those slides with my other colleagues presenting, but just to highlight, I think it's funny how we see from 2018 in the bottom where you see FDA permits the marketing of artificial intelligence-based device. And then you see in 2020, first, AI device. And then again, 2021, first AI device. So I think we're moving a little bit beyond the first, at this point into more becoming a reality, of an area that we have to all pay attention to. We heard the tool pointing at the paper in front of you from Benjamin Zital, highlighting now it's really crossing multiple therapeutic areas. And it's not just the radiology or cardiology area. So I think it's really, we need to pay attention to it. But going a little bit beyond the devices, I came from the Center for Drugs, so we're seeing quite a bit of innovations across the board here, even all the way from early development to the basic science and preclinical. Some of this may be outside of the regulatory authorization, but we have to be aware of as regulators and understand it because it still lends itself to understanding the technology development in general. In clinical development, we've seen some really interesting work around adherence in clinical trials, recruitment and retention in clinical trials. All of you are aware of the challenges we have around recruitment and retention in clinical trials. Many clinical trials actually fail for the simple factor of not recruiting enough people. So it's an interesting area where we see AI is really lending a hand. And then, of course, post-market and pharmacovigilance is an area that we're all aware of how AI is really contributing around the analysis of the data and making us understand certain trends in pharmacovigilance. I put in the bottom, AI will have an impact across sectors and across therapeutic areas, because if you look at the innovators in this area, they go beyond the biotech and pharma. I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to the technology sector. And some of the innovations we've been hearing about comes actually from mattress companies who actually sleep patterns, capturing data on sleep patterns. So you can imagine the scope of this data that's going to come to us and may feed into AI development. So FDA has for a while been aware of the digitization and working around addressing the needs for clarity around that. This is just a few examples of some of our guidances that go all the way from electronic source data to EHR. And everybody's mentioned actually the discussion paper from our colleagues at the Center for Devices that followed up with an action plan in January of this year. And I think this is just an example of the flow of the efforts that hopefully we're going to see continue across the board. I want to bring back the aspect of real-world data very briefly and real-world evidence, because as you see on the right side, there is a program at the FDA to kind of facilitate our understanding of how this real-world data can be helpful in generating evidence. One key challenge is actually illustrated by Mark Twain saying here is, in the real world, nothing happens at the right place and the right time. This is, in contrast to clinical trials where you have pre-specifications, included, if you would. And the challenge is really clear when you look at EHR in the United States. Although we have everybody almost using EHR, there are tremendous amount of vendors, tremendous amount of variable system that we have to deal with. To my surprise, fax and CD-ROM is still being used to exchange data. So you can see it's almost, they use the word of electronic in electronic health record is a kind of a misnomer here. And I think we need to see developments around how to make best use of this data. And I personally believe AI, as shown in some of those publications with the links, can really lend a hand here and make us understand how real-world data can be utilized a little bit better to produce evidence. So I know this is maybe a little bit kind of simplistic here, but I love to use this example actually from, it's not even a scientific or medical article. It came actually from an article at the New York Times on Halloween costumes. And it describes an AI algorithm that selects the Halloween costumes, but it gave this example in the box when an AI algorithm was given the task of sorting a list of numbers and while minimizing errors. So what does the algorithm do? It deletes the whole list because that's the most assured way of not having any errors. I like this example. Hopefully we're beyond this example, but I like this example because it highlights that the prediction algorithm can provide us with the most likely outcomes, not necessarily the most suitable outcome from a clinical perspective or from a contextual perspective. An AI may produce unpredictable and or unconventional solutions, and keep that in context of our reviewers within regulatory agencies who are used to evaluating clinical trials and what I would call conventional kind of solutions or outcomes. So what does that really mean for us as regulators moving forward? Okay, let's move to the next one. So understanding the complexity is really important. And I gave a couple examples here, one about benchmarking, which is the International Telecommunication Union and the WHO are working around. How to kind of have an understanding around what's really a benchmarking that works within the specific clinical context, detecting and managing bias as parts of that. Variable standard of care, like even between Europe and the US, for example, we have different approaches to healthcare. What does that really mean when you want to train an AI? When you choose a data set to train an AI system? Statistical methodology is a part of that. And then also, very importantly, the human interface. A lot of the speakers touched on this aspect, but when we have an AI algorithm interacting with a physician or interacting with a patient or clinical trial participants, what does that really mean? What's this interface lead to? All the issues that a lot of you raised, trust, perceptions, potential behavioral outcomes are all factors here to be considered in general. So our product CDRH produced this, the framework for software as a medical device, and they have this really intriguing figure in it, and a lot of you are probably familiar with it. A couple of things to take from this one. If you look at the top where we have good machine learning practices, I think we need more working together a little bit to define what does that really mean in the context of AI development and AI system deployment. The other aspect, if we look at the bottom right, another red box there where we have real world performance monitoring. And this real world performance feeds back onto potential retraining and potential consideration even in how this algorithm was introduced to the market. So this continuous evaluation is another factor for all of us to consider and think about, and defining those terminologies are important. You see papers such as from Harvey and Gouda, for example, highlighting the total life cycle approach, highlighting the GMB for AI, if you would. And I think this all are areas we have to consider moving forward collectively. This has been mentioned too, but I think this is really an important aspect, the work of Consort and Spirit, around the protocols and also publications when you have AI used as in clinical trials or clinical intervention. I think this is really critical because it's the first step into highlighting what can we do better around documentation and transparency for AI. And I think this is an area that's really important across the board, developers to regulators to even patients and end users. So I think thanks to this group for actually working on this, give us a first step to really think about documentation and transparency. The other thing I think is worth mentioning, and during still all of us dealing with this pandemic, we've seen a lot of guidance development around COVID, and this is an example of that from the FDA, the conduct of a clinical trial during the pandemic. And if you look at and read this guidance, one really interesting thing about it is it highlights a lot of remote operations that are enabled using digital tools and using hopefully algorithms as well. And it's really going to push us to start thinking, you know, what part of this is part of an ecosystem that should last and should continue moving forward to make clinical trial more efficient. And I put below some examples all the way from commercial publication to actual scientific papers to clinical trials, where you see these steps, you know, in trying to understand how AI can help us during this pandemic. So going to my last couple of slides, what's the FDA is doing? So we're doing quite a bit, and I put some examples here for example, the Digital Health Center of Excellence, you see that on the right. This is from our Center for Devices, but also it's an initiative that hopefully will provide an infrastructure to work around digital health across the agency and not just for Center for Devices. You've seen that both action plan and the framework proposed by CDRH. CEDAR, actually, Center for Drugs, recently established a steering committee specifically for AI. We call it the AISC. And its goal is to coordinate, educate, facilitate, and project projects and ideas, and also to build common understanding, and also to communicate and speak with one voice as a center. So this is a central place where actually our AI activity can converge. We also established the Office of New Drugs, established an innovative science and technology approaches for new drugs pilot program. I put in the box what's really kind of a key for us today, which is the use of artificial intelligence-based algorithm to evaluate patients, develop novel endpoints, and inform study design. So this is just some examples for us and how we're moving forward. So I have some key questions for us, and I think this is not just for us as regulatory agencies, but also across the board as a community. So we need to really do better at defining what are the parameters for transparency and documentation, what are the needed validation and benchmarking approach, and can our current policies and regulation and policy development process, and I think this is really important. You know, if you think about how we develop guidances and policies, it takes sometimes years. How is this relevant in a time where a technology can evolve really fast within months? And we need to be responsive to that. What will an effective workforce and work processes look like for a robust regulatory agency? And then what are the ethical implications? You know, I ask the questions, are our IRBs and DSMBs or DMCs ready to handle these tools when they see them and in kind of clinical trial application and protocols, et cetera? So all of this are just some examples, I think, of questions we really have to work together on trying to address. I will leave you with this latest report from Stanford that provided an AI index that have #1 in its AI investment in drug design and discovery increased significantly, but it highlights other interesting aspects too, such as the diversity problem, the diversity challenge we have, and also the ethics and the need to really start defining the ethical component here around the use of those algorithms. So I want to thank my colleague who actually lead a lot of the work here, Jacqueline Kurgan-Pry, my boss, Rose Burcell, John Concata, who lead the real-world evidence program, Karen Boyd, who lead a lot of the work around the cloud infrastructure, Nina Sachs, who lead innovations in clinical trials, and Matthew Diamond from Center for Devices, who collaborate across the board with us. With that said, thank you so much for your time, and I will look forward to the discussion. Back to you.
Thank you, Kair, very much for sharing AI in action at FDA and also to touch upon complexities and issues under the hood, as you call it so nicely. Also for helping us to catch a little bit of the time. Thank you so much. I move swiftly on to the fourth talk, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to Wolfgang Lauer. Wolfgang, you are the head of division medical device at the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, BfArM, Germany, and you will present us the BfArM perspective on AI in medical devices and digital health application. Please, Wolfgang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Saida. Thank you very much. Can you hear me and see the slides? Everything okay?
Everything in order, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome everybody. So the aspect of being almost the last in the session is that most of the things have already been said, but not by everyone. So maybe there are some repetitions here in my talk, but I will try to move forward as fast as quickly and maybe give you a little bit different insight, because our perspective as a European competent authority here in Germany is a little bit different from others maybe. So first of all, the BfArM, the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices in Germany, is a higher authority within our portfolio of our Ministry of Health in Germany, and our main issues of about 1,300 people, employees here, are licensing and improving the safety of drugs, to register, evaluate risks of medical devices. We don't have market approval here in Europe, as you know, to monitor traffic with narcotics and precursors, and also a big part and growing part establish classifications, terminology, standards, and data-based information systems for healthcare for Germany. So we have developed quite a central role here in this area throughout the past years. So I would totally agree to what my colleague from the FDA has just said. We are living in the world of medical devices in a very changing world. We have a broad range of devices and application scenarios. We have these kinds of classic devices that I guess will never vanish, like a hip joint that's quite hard to do on a digital basis, or like a heart valve or other things, for example. But throughout the past years, we've seen an increasing number of areas of digital applications, of apps, of software, of smartwatches, wearables, of complete systems with ECG hardware, for example. So we have a very fascinating and very dynamically changing world. And the question is, what do we see tomorrow? If you think about these communication tools that you can buy already now and maybe combine some thoughts, then it could be that in some years you have Dr. McCoy virtually answering to your questions, discussing funny things about Star Trek and also about your health. And then the next day, all your medication will be delivered at home, and well, it will already be administered by any applicators, for example. So this is the question: how will medical devices in the future look like? And that's something that we deal with for quite a long time already at BfArM. So we've been discussing very much questions about when software, when apps are medical devices or not. We are offering guidance to people here on our website. We had several conferences on this issue, looking at the whole pathway from the idea to in fostering innovation, to bringing things onto the market, classifying them, the questions on data safety, patient needs, and also, not at the last point, a very important reimbursement questions. So how can innovative ideas really get money to continue? We've published some things on that and also got into very intense dialogue with developers on cybersecurity issues, because when you talk about digitization and artificial intelligence, as we're doing today, then cybersecurity is a very, very important point on that. And this is also something that has developed very much with new kinds of devices. And I'll a little bit later talk about our DIGA fast track and also explain the word a little bit more. And we had a very interesting roadshow throughout Germany in 2019, just before the pandemic year, to promote this issue. So I'm repeating a little bit what has been said already with maybe some other sources and some other insights. When we talk about artificial intelligence, then this is something that promises a lot of things, but also in a lot of cases is quite a black box. And we don't really know what the algorithms are developing like, what the basis for the data is, whether a learning algorithm in clinical practice can be subject to fraud later on, or just to not good learning progress, things like that. And so when you look on reliability issues, then you always see that AI is better than some kinds of human groups. Usually it's not as good as very experienced people. Sometimes, depending on the study, it may be. But however, in most of the cases, you don't know how it gets to its decisions. And this, especially from the point of view of a regulator, is a very critical point, because you want to ensure quality, you want to ensure safety throughout the whole life cycle. Another example for a reliability question is, of course, when you look about how this AI gets its information and comes to its conclusion. And there are some examples here in literature, for example, where it's about picture recognition. So that algorithms that recognize trains on pictures, or horses or something else, but in this case maybe trains, quite often they are not trained to really recognize the trains themselves, but the railroad tracks, because they are trained to combine a train, when they want to identify it, with the surrounding railroad track. And this is a clever approach, of course, but in some other cases, depending on illnesses, for example, you would have to be aware of that fact that there is not a direct recognition of your aim, but also sometimes of other related aspects, and that's important to know in terms of reliability. Third example on that is, of course, questions of fraud and of cyber attacks. So if you have algorithms that, for example, detect cancer in images, then you have to make sure that these images and the algorithms work as they should, and that there is no attack possibility by cybersecurity attacks, for example, that change the algorithms themselves, or in this case, where there was a research done, where the pictures were changed, so the well-functioning algorithm got to a wrong decision later on just by changing the input data. And this, of course, is something that we also have to take into account when we talk about these kinds of black boxes AI that comes to a result always, but if you're not sure about what this result is based on. So especially for us as regulators, it's very important to take these aspects into account, and the FDA has I think taken a lot of very, very good steps in this area, as we have just heard in the talk before mine, and has really invested a lot of thoughts and discussions and consultation in this area. And of course, we see here a paradigm shift, and we know that in terms of developing algorithms, in terms of developing devices, we enter completely different worlds from what we live in as regulators today, where we usually have devices that are finished when they are delivered and brought to the patient. So always the question that all over the world we have to deal is, how do we regulate and what do we want to regulate? How do we want to test, ensure, how often, in which areas of the life cycle? How to do risk management? Do the classic approaches in risk management, are they still valid for these kinds of devices, or do we have to change them completely? Because they are based on a certain model of risk. And is this still the same of risk? And of course, the question, who's responsible for the result and for faults? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the clinic, the hospital where the device is working? So as regulators, of course, we have to find a clear structure of responsibility, because otherwise we will end up in people pointing at each other and not being able or not willing to take the responsibility. So these are very important questions, and we're dealing with them here at BfArM and also in the European context in the work groups. A little bit of focus on from our side, because we're very happy about this process, are the DiGA, the digital health applications. This is the German abbreviation for that, digital health applications. And this is something, a process that we at BfArM have since 2020, where we, for the first time, really also decide on reimbursement of digital health applications in Germany. And that's at least, it's about 72 million reimbursed people. So it's quite a lot of money and important decisions on that. And our approach here in Germany by our government has been that there should be a fast-track approach to reimbursement as an add-on, of course, on CE marking for medical devices of low risk classes 1 and 2A, according to the European system. And they have the main medical device functions, of course. They have to be based on digital technologies mainly, and they are only to be used by the patient or in combination with the healthcare provider. So it's not about, let me say, just radiologic systems in hospitals, but it's really digital applications in the hands of patients. And that's very important. They have to show safety and performance, mainly by the CE marking, of course. And in addition to that, they have to show data protection, information security, and further quality requirements, as, for example, interoperability, which are not, or to some extent only, covered by CE marking, but especially interoperability here and other aspects are add-ons that we also check again. And very important point, they have to provide positive healthcare effects to the healthcare system in Germany due to reimbursement here. And there has also been a step taken forward to divide that into two areas. First of all, of course, the classical medical benefits like mortality, morbidity, quality of life, because they are diagnostic or therapeutic applications. But second, we have introduced this patient-related improvement of structure and processes in healthcare, which is quite a long term and description, but mainly it's about things that could not be done before with classic medical devices. Like, for example, here it's possible with mobile devices to ensure health literacy, to ensure adherence of therapies, to ensure patient autonomy in areas where there are no doctors or hospitals in a short way, but where you would have to travel quite far and spend a lot of time. So positive healthcare effects can also be just easing the life of chronic patients by using these mobile and digital applications. And that's very important. And you can find this slide on our homepage and also in the slides afterwards, so I will not go into details. Only so far that we have an assessment process, and it's called a fast track because this assessment process is really 3 months at BfArM without any clock stop time, where we do the assessment of requirements in a technical way and also of the positive healthcare effects. And then you have either a preliminary admission if there is no final evidence, but all safety aspects assured. So you have 12 months where you can prove your final evidence, let me say, in clinical studies, but already are reimbursed with your application. And after that, all evidence has to be shown for a final listing that you, of course, can also get in advance if you have everything ready. So that's a very fascinating approach. And in this area, we also, of course, have seen some approaches in terms of artificial intelligence. So they are not that familiar at the moment, to be honest, but there are some approaches in terms of, for example, migraine clustering, of diagnosis based on input by patients. So we see more and more artificial intelligence approaches that are also to be included in these digital healthcare applications and are really fascinating opportunities of using these advantages, but also to take care about the risks that are related to them. So as BfArM, we think, of course, like all others that are here today, because that's the reason why you're here, AI is better in a network. So we are very closely working together with the HMA EMA Big Data Task Force, within the plans and within the Exchange Forum. And we are also actively taking part in the ITU WHO focus group on AI for health, because we think that artificial intelligence is such a worldwide aspect where we need standards, where we need frameworks like were already presented today to ensure quality, to have standardized test data sets, to really get to know what you can be sure about, because it's much more complicated in an AI world, at least from my point of view, than it was before. So these are the areas where we're working also with this focus group, and we really can support this group and hope that a lot of people and a lot of also competent authorities are joining this group and some others. So also in our work here at BfArM, we use AI components. We have our own research and signal detection group where we use AI components in our vigilant cases, in our risk data here, because we think that really AI helps us to keep the focus on the big picture instead of getting lost in all of the details, and to use this tool to help our assessors take their decisions, and the decisions are still taken by human beings, but to help them keep the overview on the data, get information about hints and maybe important signals, and help them to do their work better also in the future with, I think, increasing complexity of our data and also of the devices. So some more information on our website if you're interested, or of course, if you want to contact me directly, here's my contact data. So thank you very much, and I wish all of you good discussions also tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for sharing such valuable insights on how BfArM is also keeping focus on the big picture. I quite like the way you put this one. We move swiftly on to the fifth and last presentation by Boris Brelian from Pfizer for a company perspective on using AI to aid drug development. Boris, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having us present some of our example solutions. I actually invited some of experts in what we will be talking about. We'll show some of the 4 production solutions that really help us in drug development. And how do we know that? All of these were used last year. As you know, Pfizer has been a little busy with the vaccine development, and on all of these solutions have really helped us accelerate and make the work of our scientists and data science experts a lot more efficient. And so these 4 colleagues will talk about sort of very diverse set of production solutions that we have, from automation and data reconciliation related to data management within a clinical trial, to automation and regulatory portfolio around use of predictive analytics to properly design the filing strategy for our submissions, to automation and pharmacovigilance with the increased volume of safety cases. How do we use automation and artificial intelligence to augment processing and intake of cases? And last but not least, we'll talk about some automation and statistical table quality control to ensure the consistency and accuracy of our data before it goes into clinical study report. And just to cover some of I fully agree with Wolfgang that being the last one of the day, I think you'll hear some common themes. But some of the lessons we're learning in using AI within a pharmaceutical company is that it starts with alignment on what constitutes success. What are you looking for from the percentage of accuracy that the machine needs to produce? That's very, very important to understand up front. Information and meta-information standardization will really help and drive the success of these types of projects. Change management activities, really making sure that your colleagues understand that these solutions are there to augment and aid in human decision-making, not replace it. That is something that's very, very important to ensure the hearts and minds, to ensure that the colleagues fully participate and provide their best in developing these solutions. And then clearly the whole notion of validating AI-based solution, because it is no longer dealing with pure input-output based software. And because we're a pharmaceutical company, not a software development house, we buy mostly instead of develop. And so in many cases, it's more of a black box for us. And so ensuring that there are clear guidances and partnership understanding across the industry and regulators on how do we properly validate and ensure trust in these AI-based algorithms is very, very critical. And the last but not least is user experience. It becomes even more important to ensure that you include ability for the machine to learn, right, based on the use of the system by our users is tremendously critical. And so with that, without further ado, I'll actually ask my colleagues to showcase some of these 4 solutions. And at the end, we'll certainly have time for questions and answers. So with that, Prasanna, if you don't mind kicking us off, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Boris, and thank you, HMA EMA, for this opportunity. So this use case is in clinical data management. So the problem space, as previously mentioned, lots of complexity in the data. We're talking adverse events, concomitant medication, and so on and so forth. High volume of data. Every study has millions of clinical data points, and it's coming rapidly at us. When you have something like a vaccine study with 46,000 subjects, a lot of data to reconcile in a very short period of time. So reduction in what we call as the cycle time between when the data was entered, when it was analyzed, and when we sent a query. A query is a question to the site to ask about a discrepant data. So the approach we took, our current status is steps 1, 2, and 3, which is data comes in through our electronic data capture system and other systems as well. And the second step there is data manager doing a review of data through listings and reports. That's the tools we have today. And then the step 3 is to look at a discrepant data point and raise a query, which goes back into the EDC system for a site to act on the data. So we improved that process by introducing steps 4 through 7, where we let our data managers, the subject matter experts, train the machines, providing ground truth data. And the trained machine makes a prediction, that's step 5. And then we use the human in the loop approach for approving or rejecting prediction by the machine. Approval means it is raising the query automatically. Rejection is also helpful because that helps us look at our false positives and retrain the machines. So we had a lot of challenges with variability across studies, and also false negatives is an important thing to note in this, because once you start to use machine learning models and the models don't predict, that's a false negative, right? So we have made sure that we have a very low frequency of false negatives, and we did that by improving our false positives. Even though there's a lot of signal to noise ratio, having a healthy number of false positives is helping us in eliminating the false negative scenario. Of course, interpretability and explainability of a deep learning model is always challenging. So we've come up with a confidence score by letting the machine tell us how confident it is with the prediction. And last but not the least, change management, which Boris already spoke about. So I'll just focus on the value. We got 50% reduction in time between data capture and query issue on some of our pilot studies. And we are rolling it out to our entire portfolio this year. Ultimately, we are hoping that a near real-time prediction will help a lot in data quality, because that would behave just like an edit check. And these are very complex scenarios where edit checks don't work. So with that, I'll hand it over to Pooja for her slide next. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Prasanna. Thanks, everyone. I'll cover an automation in our regulatory portfolio planning and monitoring space that we've brought in. We here at Pfizer have an increasing workload due to complexity and the number of submissions across the world. And a lot of the planning and monitoring activities around submissions has been done very, very manually. So we set out with the vision to try and automate the space to reduce the operational time in planning and monitoring. And our first step was to really consolidate all of the data across multiple systems, across multiple contributors that manage this data, model the data, and model all of the filing plans across the entire Pfizer portfolio. We brought it all together, built complex business rules, all the regulatory requirements at the market level, and that has enabled us to produce a light touch filing plan that we've now been able to roll out across 35,000 different submissions across 50 markets in about a year. This predictive modeling-based regulatory planning platform has been extremely successful, and we are seeing up to 40% reduction in manual work across the various markets. From a lessons learned perspective, I think Boris covered quite a bit of what I have on the slide here, but the most important and the critical piece here is around data governance and data quality. These need to be ingrained within our business processes, within our business ownership culture, and not necessarily viewed always as a cleanup or a remediation activity. And the other piece is around user adoption and really taking the users on the journey with us, so that there is a lot of trust and they understand how these are being built, and that has helped us make this really successful. With that, I'll, I think, hand off to Anna.
Thank you, Pooja. Automations and pharmacovigilance. So the problem we're facing is that the manual processing of ICSRs It's just not sustainable. I mean, the volume of adverse events are in the millions and are continually growing. Technology has to evolve. We have to keep up and we have to find a solution for the processing of these adverse events. And our approach was first to optimize our business processes through a single global intake tool. That lays a foundation for a comprehensive automation program. It has to be source agnostic automation. This enables the processing of both structured and unstructured data, thereby reducing the time it takes to get information into the safety system and enhancing the automation that we could possibly do. What we've learned by implementing this single global intake tool is that we need to have frequent quality training of our data cycles to optimize, mostly also to account for the data scarcity or those rare events that we have in pharmacovigilance at times. Continuous performance monitoring is key to minimize the non-conformance, and we also have to have a robust, documented validation system. The true key component to this is having that human in the loop. We need to have a balanced approach to automation, having the human at the right time and at the right step of our process. And our other advice is to be cautious in the beginning. Define the short-term wins in terms of short sprints, but keep in mind your long-term vision and strategy for the sustainable success. What this allows us to do is scalability, the capability of auto-processing these large amounts of AEs. And this is how we evolve, and this is how we become innovative. We move beyond the current paradigm of just using rule-based approaches or mapping to future natural language processing and machine learning. And that's excitement in automation and pharmacovigilance. Over to Dan.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you for having me today, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the automation of statistical table QC using machine learning and natural language processing. And at Pfizer, we leverage about 1,000 statistical programmers to process, format, and QC clinical data for analysis and reporting. The QC step is particularly time-consuming, manually intensive, and error-prone. And these errors are often found during downstream review processes, which results in lost calendar time, rework, and many internal challenges. Our ultimate goal here is to be able to remove this manual QC step, and also known as human in the loop, which I think others have talked about over the past few moments, and really position our resources on higher value tasks and portfolio acceleration. From an approach perspective, we opted to leverage our existing processes and SOPs to ensure the highest accuracy and also to balance the risk of using cutting edge technology. And really aligning on how we were going to use a tool before we sought a tool was really critical, because many of the vendors that we spoke with, wanted to kind of flip the model on its head and really look at how, the tool can drive the process. And because of the, where this technology is in the maturity curve, it's not something we were comfortable with in terms of clinical data. And so once we found a partner that was comfortable, taking our approach of, starting out conservative and defining those small successes, and then really building that trust and moving, the organization forward, we started to focus on how we could eliminate the double programming, or what we're using as programmers to check, the programs to check the programs. So we've been able to implement 4 checks using a combination of machine learning and natural language processing. And these checks vary from verifying subject counts across tables, verifying appropriate data standards were used, or verifying summarized counts across subgroups. And that's illustrated on the graphic on the slide here. And it's been really successful. We have had some challenges, which I'll speak to in a moment, but we have really, or we're about to be able to eliminate that double programming step for the specific checks. But we do plan to keep human in the loop for the time being. What we're seeing from a challenges perspective is really around the trust of individual statistical programmers. Many of these colleagues are highly experienced, highly competent, detailed professionals. And introducing machines to do an element of their work is really challenging from a change management perspective, and really kind of speaks back to that trust factor. We've had to go through the process and prove out the accuracy of the models. And I think Dr. Andre Decker spoke earlier today that the models may be more accurate than people, right? People make plenty of mistakes. And so really defining that threshold, as others outlined, is critical. Another challenge that we're facing is around agency guidance. And this is really from a few different perspectives. Number one, tech companies are treating these algorithms as their IP, and they're not really allowing, as Boris said, us to kind of get under the covers, and they're a black box, and that can be challenging from an operational perspective. And so we have to spend a significant amount of time, training these modules with our data and proving the accuracy from a tried and true process perspective versus being able to look at the technology more closely. Others already spoke about system validation, so I won't dive into that more deeply. But really, and when can we look at these processes and begin to remove some of those humans in the loop? As we have talked about today, machines can be, not always, but can be more accurate than humans. And so when we identify processes that a human does not do as well as a machine, removing them is something that I think would help the technology and the process overall. Very quickly, in terms of some lessons learned, we've found that although we have many standards and SOPs in place, different therapeutic areas do have their own nuances and processes, and identifying those nuances up front have really helped to increase the efficiency of the tool as well as the efficiency of the process. And you have to make sure that colleagues are used to and ready to maybe change some of their business processes to support the technology. Also, as I mentioned already, the training of each check that we've done has used a large amount of data. We anticipated about 600 different tables to train these algorithms, and we've actually had to double that for each check. So we're taking about 1,200 tables and listings and pushing that through to ensure the appropriateness of the process as well as the accuracy of the data. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Boris.
Thank you, everyone. So hopefully you've been able to take this journey with us through 4 fairly diverse solutions that are utilizing artificial intelligence in a pharmaceutical company. It's certainly a journey. It's not a quick delivery. It takes a lot of time to learn to find the right partners. As a pharmaceutical company, we were also forced to find these new vendors, these new innovative organizations to partner with, to use a mountain of data that we have to drive those algorithms and really help in augmenting the decision making. And again, thank you so much. It's been really, truly a pleasure to participate, and we're looking forward to answering the questions.
Well, thank you, Boris and colleagues. Again, thank you for fascinating insights on 4 very different activities. Very much appreciated. That brings us, actually, you also helped us to get back some time for the question and answers part, and an opportunity for the audience to ask questions for fantastic panelists in this session today. I've seen a few questions already, and I was wondering, Lucy, there was a question on whether these tools are publicly available, but also if they are based on cases. Can you maybe clarify orally so that it's being recorded rather than actually staying in the chat? Could you bring some?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for the question. Yes, we're looking into making available the code available on GitHub for some of what I mentioned in my talk. So hopefully it's coming, but it will require a bit of coordination also, because, for example, the vectors they relate to Medra. Medra is developed by MSSO, so we need to make sure that we have everybody on board for doing this.
Thank you very much. I saw also to Kair, you received a question as well. Maybe you would like to also spell it out orally? Or?
Yes, sure. I received a question on if the CPAM, the Critical Path Institute pathway, is the ideal way to get in touch with the FDA if you have a proposal on AI use in clinical trials. And my answer was, depending on the context, yes, CPAM can be the right approach. But I highlighted also that we're trying also to encourage more of an academic style dialogue for mutual learning. We found that to also inform us internally. And AI steering committee at CEDAR have been engaging with external stakeholders around AI proposal, just to bring kind of more of an academic style dialogue that's really mutually helpful across the board.
Thank you very much. I actually had another question. So you've been quite clear on opportunities offered by the use of AI across the spectrum in medicines regulation at FDA. But I was wondering, from a medical policy perspective, what would you see requiring convergence at a global level over and above regional level? Kai?
It's a really good question, and it's something I've been personally struggling with, because I hear all the discussions around standards, right? And I feel like, first of all, we need to get to the point of understanding where are standards really useful, and balancing the need for clarity around what's the guardrail we're talking about around standards and regulatory considerations per se, while also allowing a room for innovation. So I would say it's really I think at least from the point of where we are right now in knowledge, I think that should be also an evolution across the board around all collaborating across the board, and how we're going to come up with those standards, with those guardrails, with those approaches, if you would. I see us, for example, coming up with the discussion frameworks and getting a little bit more input across the board. As you've seen, our colleagues at CDRH have done that already. So I know I'm not answering your question fully here, but I hope there's going to be more engagement across the board in this area.
Thank you very much for this insight. Actually, then maybe a question that could potentially apply to remaining panelists. So the idea of this workshop is to somehow get ideas around legislation or legislative frameworks that would actually embrace or allow for these scientific advancements to reach full potential. And I think AI definitely falls under this. Could I ask a reflection on what you think would be the main priorities to reach the full potential of AI in medicines and medicines regulation? And maybe, I don't know, Wolfgang, would you like to address this, but also later Florence, and maybe also after an industry perspective on this. Wolfgang, would that be something you would like to address?
Yes, of course. Well, I think it's as Kaya said, it's about innovation and about creativity, I think, mainly. So we have to find a balance between free possibilities to be creative and innovative, and also, of course, in kinds of sandboxes with real world applications and real world data, because it should not be just an academic thing, but something that's really useful and also guided by the need, the practical medical need. And on the other hand, of course, as regulators, we need to ensure if these aspects are applied to patients, then we need to agree on a, let me say, appropriate level of safety and reliability that can change maybe and can grow. So I think this balance would be important. Thanks.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I don't know, Florence, would you like to share some considerations? Maybe, I don't know, specifically in the therapeutic area of your expertise, if there is anything that could somehow unlock the potential?
Thank you very much, Zaide. Yeah, I think from my own experience in the therapeutic area and having had the opportunity to discuss with different stakeholders in various platforms and for a few months now in congresses and other type of meetings that we are also organizing with learned societies such as ECNP or ICTM. I think, to me, what seems quite important is that we all speak the same language to start with. I've noticed that quite often we talk about those tools in different manners, using different type of denomination, nomenclature, and I would think that if we manage to agree, and it's complex enough, the field, I think that we have to start with the basics. That's my own personal view, and we have clear understanding of the definition and the scope in which we want to evolve together. I think that would be already a good, really a good start to if we have this solid basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florence. And in fact, we have a largely regulatory dominated session. I was wondering, what's the view of Boris from a company perspective? What would you think are the main priorities to reach full potential in AI in the context of a new regulatory framework?
I would say from a industry perspective, it's very hard to go at this alone, right? I think that a very significant degree of collaboration as an industry, but also industry with regulators to achieve common understanding of what's considered the right utilization and use of AI, but also to share the data to train and create better models. And then we can all innovate from a proprietary and competitive perspective on how we utilize the models. But a lot of this, I think, is in this case is better together. And we would achieve much more potential if we approach it as an industry, but also industry collaborating with regulators. That I believe that to be a huge degree of success to unlock artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much for this clarification or input. I would like actually to give the floor to Lauren Oliva from Biogen UCOP. Could you address your question, please?
Yes, are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we do, please.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Yeah, so I just was making the note about the fact that it seemed like several of our presenters, both regulators and others, had addressed the fact that there's a lot of interdependencies with real-world evidence, as well as some of the learning healthcare systems. And as we started the discussion today, referencing the pharma strategy and legislation, there's a lot of interdependencies with policies that are being developed. So I'd just be curious to hear really from all of the panelists their thoughts on how we avoid duplication and think about how we kind of bring these policies together in a very meaningful way, both in Europe and in the US.
Yes, great. Maybe shall we start with Lucy? Do you have any views on the question, or otherwise? Yeah.
Yes, actually not really. I mean, we are we are not a regulator entity, so we do not really work in the space of developing policy or anything. So I think it's best for me to actually pass that question on to somebody with a regulatory background.
Okay, apologies. I'll hand over to Kair, please.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because, I feel like we have no choice here but to collaborate together and ensure that we're not being duplicative. And, alignment here is a key. And following up to what I heard just about the collaboration, I think collaboration should be regulator and pharma and beyond, the biotechnology and technology sectors and anybody really working on those tools. So yes, absolutely. The one thing I mentioned, and you have in your question real world evidence and learning healthcare and innovative study design. I think this is an area that we, by necessity, we're already collaborating at the global level. Like take, for example, trying to define what does it mean to have documentation and transparency around observational data sets, right? Or around, AI algorithms. We have a good system to track clinical trials, registrations, results, et cetera, but we didn't have those systems for AI algorithms and for data sets per se. And we have to collaborate and to ensure, we're not redundant and we're not duplicative and frankly delaying the promising tools that could come to patients, and those who need them at a faster rate. So, yeah, I think we should build up on current collaborations and even expand those as much as we can.
Thank you very much. I see a question also at the end, just quickly, by Ip Alstrup. Please, could you be unmuted and address your question, please?
Oh, I couldn't find my mute. Thank you. Yes, but it is simply, I think that they were really great presentations today, and I would like to hear from Pfizer if you could maybe elaborate on, because you said you would like a collaboration between industry and regulators. So what would you need from regulators? Could you maybe elaborate on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Boris had to step away for a personal engagement, so I'll field the question, but I'll also tag in my colleagues as well. So we did not prepare a coordinated answer for that question today, so I'll speak from my personal perspective. One of the challenges we have is that these algorithms revolve around IT systems, and IT system validation is something that's very highly regulated and highly controlled. but you may not be changing, the edges of the rest of the system. It may be adding new algorithms directly, into an existing use case. And so, without guidance, we're going above and beyond to ensure that, things are managed to the highest levels. But I think, having some more guided specifications, whether they be more kind of statistical based, like a qualifications document versus systems validation, at least from my own personal perspective, what would be helpful guidance. But, Prasanna, I see you on video. Anna, Pooja, please feel free to chime in.
Thank you for the question. From my perspective, I think a good succinct definition of the general machine learning practice, which has been discussed in the white paper issued by the FDA recently in January, that will be very helpful for us to give us a framework to understand how to audit and report on ground truth and machine learning algorithms capabilities of producing the desired output and so on and so forth. So really we need some guidance on GMLP.
Thank you very much for this input. I have a question also for Kim. Kim, as a young data scientist, fairly recently joined EMA. So what would be your vision for EMA in terms of process analytics, AI, and automation? What would be your vision if you wanted to design the agency the way you would like it?
Thank you, Zaid, for the question. Yeah, well, I would like to be a leading regulator that uses emerging technologies for the benefit of patients and animal health. That would be my mission, to implement all what is possible, to be at front of all the other regulatory agencies.
Thank you, Kim. And I have, sorry, was there someone wanting to? I have another question for Wolfgang, please. You've shown quite a roadmap on activities at BfArM in this digital space, and it goes back already since 2014. So my question is, what do you think will be your next big thing on that roadmap? And if you have any kind of other considerations you would like to share.
Well, I think let me say in Germany generally, I think digitization and interoperability are very, very important aspects. So our, let me say, governmental roadmap in the health area is really bringing together digital sources in a digital roadmap. And this means electronic patient records, this means digital health applications, and this means also exchange formats in data so that data also can be used for research further. And BfArM has an, let me say, really increasing role in this, gathered throughout the past years. And we are currently facing also some regulatory drafts, legislative drafts, where this extent of the digital health applications is also going to be extended to caregiving applications and also to interfaces between implants and digital health applications. So I think for us, the road will lead very much towards interoperability and all kinds of health data in connection with devices in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. I think this is a nice one to conclude this question and answer session. I would like to very much thank you for valuable presentations. I have no doubt that the audience has had a fantastic day. Peter, I would like to hand over to you to conclude the day, if that's okay. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, indeed. What a great afternoon. And thanks, Zaida, for a really interesting interactive session. A big thanks to all the chairs and speakers and participants and people asking interesting questions either in the Q&A or verbally during this afternoon. I think we've had a great day. I've learned a lot. We've learned about rapid healthcare systems, and then we've learned about deep learning healthcare systems. I've heard about good simulation practices. Data is the new soil. Rules out, data in. Sounds like a chant on a picket line, doesn't it? That we have a duty to study that drugs are working in the marketplace and not just as they do in clinical trials. We've heard about stewardship for AI development and oversight of AI deployment. And then in the session that's just closed, we've heard about pharmacovigilance use cases, automation of business processes, learnings from product development at EMA, the need for guidance and frameworks, and I think that was a continuous message, that there is a bit of a gap globally, but particularly on the European side, was implied on the guidance and framework side. We had a really interesting devices perspective, and we've finished by hearing some examples from industry, and I thought it was fantastic that we were demonstrated how one presenter can become 5. Now that must have been an algorithm. So it's been a great afternoon. Tomorrow we start again at 3 p.m. Central European time prompt, and I just remind people that there's a different URL link in the invitation for tomorrow compared to today. So don't just reuse today's link. Go back to the invitation, look at the link in that invitation, because it's a different one for tomorrow. And have a great evening. Thank you very much indeed.